Before the cold tightened, some farms had already set fuel and fodder aside. That reserve mattered because winter ice and snow made travel less reliable, and a stocked yard reduced the need for urgent gathering once the ground hardened. Winter then became less a scramble than an extended management of what had been prepared earlier. In that setting, the household center shifted indoors, where ordinary work had to continue in a more compressed space. Cold season preparation linked storage, repair, shelter, and hearth use across the farm. From there, the longhouse hearth took over as the place where warmth, light, and practical labor met, and the rest of the house adjusted around it. The opening to winter was therefore less a dramatic threshold than a careful handover. Winter preparation therefore joined food, shelter, fuel, repair, and movement. The hearth could warm people, light work, and support cooking at the same time, which made it more than a fire in the middle of a room. It was the household's working center, and that mattered because a winter day had to serve several purposes at once. Yet the same enclosed space also held its own limits. Limited ventilation could leave smoke inside longhouse interiors, so the room offered usefulness together with a less pleasant burden. Even so, the hearth tied the practical life of the building together. Warmth, labor, and food preparation all converged there. Bread, porridge, and beer all drew on cereals, and the daily cereal foods changed with resources rather than following one fixed menu. That flexibility suited a season when what could be made depended on what remained available. The household's food, like its heat, followed the shape of supply. At one end of some longhouses, animals shared the building, and that arrangement changed the meaning of the wall itself. Animal space was not always separate from living space, so winter shelter could hold human life and livestock under one roof. The result was not comfort in a modern sense, but continuity. Care for the house, the herd, and the stored food all belonged to the same season. That is why the winter household feels so compact. Every part of it had to answer the cold without pretending to be apart from the rest. The same roof carried warmth, labor, food, and stock, and the structure of daily life followed that shared burden. By the time the season settled fully, the household was already organized around keeping the whole arrangement working, and the long winter ahead would press on every part of it at once. Winter readiness began long before the first hard freeze. On many farms, fuel and fodder were already stacked aside while the ground was still open, because the season of easy movement never lasted. The point was not comfort, but timing. A household with a reserve could face cold months with less emergency gathering once snow narrowed movement, while a household that waited too long could find ordinary errands turned into hard calculations. That made winter readiness a matter of autumn labor, when there was still space to cut, carry, dry, and stack, and when labor could still move with the season instead of against it. It belonged to a rural economy where access tightened fast, and it linked practical planning to the wider rhythm of the land. Fuel mattered for heat and cooking, fodder for animals, and both had to survive the same stretch of weather. The stack beside the yard was therefore a simple sign of foresight, not a proclamation of universal plenty. It marked a farm choosing to move ahead of winter rather than react to it. Stored reserves offered prudent preparation without proving universal plenty. The farm that stored ahead of time was buying a margin against weather, distance, and delay, turning the season's first danger into a manageable one before it fully arrived. By then, planning mattered more than haste, because winter did not wait for catch-up work. A stocked yard made winter planning visible in the shape of the place itself. Fuel, timber, and fodder could not be left to chance once the air turned hard, so the holding had to organize what the season would ask of it. In practice, that meant keeping useful material close enough to reach and ready for storage through the cold season. The same logic appears in Torxie's winter camp, where occupation needed fuel, timber, food, and repairs. a reminder that even short-term presence in cold weather depended on keeping supplies sorted and available. The Drowsy camp illustrates cold weather logistics only by comparison, not because every yard looked the same, but because winter forced similar answers from different settings. What mattered was orderly reserve, the stack, the store, and the space around them. Such planning reduced the labor of later gathering and made the property less vulnerable when movement became awkward. It also shows that winter preparation was never only about eating and staying warm. Timbers had to be ready for maintenance, and the holding had to remain workable even as the ground hardened. The yard therefore became a practical map of cold season priorities, showing at a glance which goods had been made safe from delay. In a season when weather could overrule habit, that kind of order had real value. It also spared people from treating every cold spell as an emergency, a real gain indeed in a clipped season. Once the weather turned, the value of what had been stacked rose quickly. Winter ice and travel hazards made movement less reliable, so the person who still needed fuel or fodder could no longer assume that the ground would cooperate. Even an ordinary gathering trip carried more uncertainty when snow pressed into paths, winter conditions worsened, and surfaces changed underfoot. That is why the labor of pre-season gathering mattered so much. It matched a rural economy where access tightened fast, and it turned the easiest weeks of the year into the best weeks for hard work. The difference was not abstract. A farm that had already filled its reserve could stay with its own stock, while one that had delayed had to depend on harder movement at the very time when movement became least dependable. The cold did not simply add discomfort, it changed how far a household could safely reach and how much it could expect from the landscape around it. That pressure helps explain the rhythm of autumn labor. Preparation took place before winter made movement less reliable. This was not a romance of preparedness, it was a plain response to ice, winter travel hazards, and the limits of travel. Late gathering was possible, but it was no longer the most dependable plan, and winter punished dependence on chance. A sensible household therefore treated the first chill as a deadline, not a warning to begin. Stored resources linked livestock and people because both needed the same cold season planning. A reserve of fodder was not separate from the reserve of fuel, it was part of one seasonal design. When a holding planned for winter, it planned for animals as well as for human needs, because a farm that could feed its stock through the cold months was protecting livestock survival and cold season care. That was one reason reserve building reached beyond the idea of dinner or warmth. It included timber and food and the upkeep that kept the whole place serviceable, since winter occupation demanded repairs as well as consumption. In a cold season, livestock care and possible animal spaces belonged to related planning. If one side of the holding failed, the other felt it. The practical result was a broader kind of caution, one that connected animals, storage, and maintenance into a single winter policy. That policy did not make hard weather disappear, it made hard weather less likely to break the farm apart. Such preparation was a hedge against hard weather, not a sign of universal plenty. The household that understood that relationship could meet winter as a whole rather than as separate emergencies. That difference mattered socially too, because it marked which households had a cushion and which had less room for delay. The distinction reminds us how narrow winter margins could be. Winter could still tax even a careful household, so margin mattered more than display in practice. These preparations had a social meaning as well, even when they stayed entirely practical. On a farm where access tightened fast, a stored margin showed that autumn work had been coordinated well enough to meet the cold on its own terms. It separated a household with some room for delay from one that would have to gamble on weather and roads. That did not make the first household rich in any simple sense. Stored goods showed margin, not abundance, and winter could still tax anyone who lived close to the edge. Yet the difference mattered because it shaped the tone of the season before it fully arrived. A prepared holding could approach the cold with less strain on people, animals, and routine, while a thinly supplied one had less room for error. Even then, the point was not triumph, but stability. Fuel, fodder, timber, and food had to be counted together, and the count itself was a kind of household discipline. When that discipline held, the farm entered winter with less urgency, and the work of gathering could give way to the longer business of simply carrying on. That was especially clear where winter ice and travel hazards made supply lines unreliable, because households then felt the pressure of every missed day. In that setting, pre-season labor belonged to the season itself, not to some extra margin above it. It was the practical shape of caution in a climate that did not pause for delay. When the last useful days closed, the point was no longer to gather more, but to trust what had already been set aside. A farm that had worked ahead of the freeze entered the cold season with fuel, fodder, timber, and food already in place, and that meant the first hard weather met less uncertainty at the yard gate. The household had not defeated winter, only reduced the number of ways it could interfere. That is enough to explain why so much effort was spent before the frost. A season that narrows movement quickly rewards the people who treat autumn as working time and not as waiting time. It also explains why winter planning belonged to the same world as livestock care and everyday maintenance. The cold asked for everything at once, and only a coordinated reserve could answer in time. The result was a quieter sort of security, built from carrying, stacking, and holding back. It did not promise abundance. It promised a better chance of getting through. By the time the first real cold settled over the farm, the important work had already been done, and the household could move into winter with its reserves waiting, its choices narrowed, and the season already partly accounted for. It was a plain answer to a season that closes paths before it closes needs. So the work before frost mattered, and the cold months began with that work already behind the household for the year ahead. Stored food and fodder helped households meet cold season needs when movement became less reliable. Across Viking farms, winter readiness began long before the cold settled in. Buildings were put together from whatever the place could support, wattle woven between timbers, clay pressed over frameworks, sturdy timber posts, stone footings, earth-packed walls, and thatch laid above them in different mixes. The result was not one fixed farmhouse, but a family of solutions shaped by woodland, soil, and the habits of a district. One settlement might lean more heavily on wood, another on stone, and another on an earth and thatch combination that suited its ground. Seen from a distance, such buildings could appear plain. Up close, they were carefully tuned to the materials at hand. That flexibility mattered because a house in northern weather had to do more than stand there. It had to hold together against rain, thaw, and the steady pressure of the season. Every beam, wall, and roof belonged to a working arrangement, not to decoration. In that sense, the farm building already carried the logic of winter inside its structure. Before fuel was gathered or stored, the shell itself needed to be the kind of shelter that could endure. The people living there were not choosing from a modern catalogue of styles. They were making a practical house from local matter, local labor, and a long habit of adjustment that kept the whole place usable when the weather turned hard. That practical flexibility also made room for change when a family grew, a roof tired, or a wall settled unevenly, because the house was meant to serve the farm through seasons, not to preserve one frozen idea of how it should look. Sloping roofs mattered because they gave rain and melting snow a way off the structure instead of letting water linger where it could do the most harm. In the same spirit, clay-lined walls or plank walls added a second line of defense, each version helping the house shrug off weather in its own way. The point was not elegance, but endurance. A roof pitched to shed moisture, and walls faced or lined to resist damp made the building less vulnerable to the long, wet wear of the seasons. In a farm setting, that kind of protection was never abstract. It shaped how safely the building could keep standing, how steadily it could serve, and how often it needed attention. The shape of the house and the substance of its surfaces were working parts of one system. Even when the outside looked simple, the arrangement inside the wall and beneath the roof carried a great deal of judgment about moisture, weight, and repair. A winter house did not succeed by being sealed forever. It succeeded by being built to take weather seriously from the beginning, with forms that channeled water away and surfaces that could be renewed when they tired. That is why the line between architecture and upkeep was so thin. The building's form was already a first repair, a way of keeping the weather from winning too quickly. That mattered most where thaw and refreeze kept cycling through the year, because a roof or wall could be judged not by how it looked in one season, but by how it held up through many turns of weather. Because damp kept returning, repeated repair was ordinary rather than notable. Timber and plaster did not fail once and stay failed. They were pressed again and again by moisture, rot, and settling, so maintenance became part of the life of the place. A farm building could be strengthened, reworked, and adjusted as conditions changed. In one district, that might mean more frequent attention to roof covering. In another, it might mean renewed wall surfaces or added support where the ground stayed wet. These were local decisions, shaped by local weather, local materials, and local ways of judging what a house needed next. Over time, a building accumulated its own biography. It might begin one way and end another, with use, repairs, and alterations leaving it different from the version first raised. That process was not a failure of planning. It was how a house remained serviceable in a climate where the same damp could keep returning. Each phase of care left its mark, and the marks mattered. They show that a farmstead was not a frozen plan copied from one place to another. It was a lived structure, revised until it fit the circumstances around it. By the time autumn deepened, the question was not whether a house had ever needed repair, but whether it had been kept in the condition that let winter pass without unnecessary strain. That is why two farms in the same broad culture could look related and still solve winter in slightly different ways, because the house on one holding answered to a different ground, a different supply of timber, and a different history of repair. Architecture could also mark difference. A farm building did not have to advertise wealth in a grand way to show that social standing, labor, and access to materials were not the same everywhere. Architecture could reflect social difference within a region, even when the overall plan still belonged to the same practical world. Some buildings were not born finished in one moment. They changed by stage of use, with rooms, walls, or surfaces taking on new roles as needs shifted. That is a useful reminder that a house was often a process rather than a single design pinned to a single day. Even the way a modern rebuilding is arranged can steer the eye, because present-day decisions about proportion, surface, and repair alter how the house is understood. So the finished image is always partly an interpretation, however carefully handled. None of this turns the farm into a fixed diagram. Instead, it shows a range of ordinary solutions within a shared culture. A military winter camp repair can offer a comparison here during a military occupation that also required repairs, but that comparison stops at the edge of the field. Farm households faced a different rhythm, with local materials, local labor, and local expectations shaping the work. The house remained practical, but it was not interchangeable with every other shelter built for cold weather. Its form spoke quietly of place, standing, and use, while still answering the year's demands. In that sense, the building could signal rank without becoming a universal recipe for how every farm should look. Taken together, These features made the farm building less like a static object and more like a yearly task that never fully ended. The frame, the roof, the wall lining, and the patched surfaces all belonged to the same practical rhythm of keeping weather at bay. What mattered before frost was not one grand act of building, but the steady act of keeping a place serviceable through the turning year. That rhythm helped explain why a house could feel both familiar and changeable. It retained its broad shape, yet the details could shift as materials were replaced, surfaces were renewed, and different stages of use left their mark. In one season, a building might be read mainly as shelter. In another, as a workspace whose walls had already been adjusted to the life of the holding. However it was read, it was never separated from the work that kept it sound. For people living with winter in mind, the building's condition was part of the season itself. A house that managed damp, redirected water, and accepted repair with some regularity gave the household room to meet the cold on steadier terms. That is the quiet story here, not a single perfect farmhouse, but a resilient one, built from local mixes, shaped by local judgment, and ready to carry on as the weather tightened around it. From there, the next concern was not the shell alone, but the practical preparations that followed once the landscape had begun to harden. That was enough to make a difficult season manageable without pretending that any one layout or repair schedule suited every holding. Across northern farms and village plots, the main longhouse was often only part of the working settlement. Around it stood outbuildings that helped carry the year, and some of them held supplies rather than people. That arrangement mattered as winter closed in, because outbuildings and storage areas expanded the farm complex. Separate sheds or storehouses formed possible parts of farm storage arrangements. On some farms, the outbuilding itself was the obvious place for such reserves, while in others, a storage area sat within a larger structure. Either way, the household landscape was practical before it was tidy. You did not always meet a neat line between living space and storage space. The settlement could work as a small cluster, with the longhouse at its center and other spaces supporting it in quieter, more specialized ways. That pattern made winter preparation less about one heroic act and more about steady organization. Grain, household goods, and other provisions could be placed where they would stay serviceable when the ground hardened. The buildings did not merely shelter people from cold, they also held the routines that let a farm keep going. In that sense, the season began long before the first frost settled on the land. It began with deciding which spaces would be kept open, which would be filled, and which would shoulder the year's extra weight. Even the simplest outbuilding could reduce congestion inside, and that mattered when work, drying, and storage all had to fit within a seasonal rhythm of use. At Umeå, the house plan sits in a useful range of possibilities. One reading allows storage, another living space, another buyer, stable, barn, or rough kitchen. And the point is not to force a single label too quickly. What matters is that a longhouse could gather more than one kind of activity under one roof. Domestic work and storage did not always occupy separate buildings with crisp boundaries between them. In some settings, the same structure could support daily tasks, keep supplies nearby, and still serve as a place people moved through for ordinary household purposes. That flexibility helped a farm answer the season without building an entirely new settlement around every need. It also explains why a room can feel familiar in one account and different in another, even when the overall household pattern remains recognizably practical. The longhouse was not just a hall for sitting or sleeping. It was also a framework for sorting labor, goods, and animals in ways that made sense locally. When fuel, food, and work implements needed a home, they could share the same broad building economy as family life. The result was not clutter for its own sake, but an arrangement shaped by use. In winter country, that kind of mixed interior mattered because longhouses could support several practical functions. A room might carry several jobs at once, and that was part of the house's strength, not a sign that it lacked order. That kind of flexibility could also keep a smaller farm from overbuilding, since one broad interior might cover several needs without multiplying walls, roofs, or thresholds. At some sites, the arrangement went a step further, and livestock space occupied one end of the building. That choice brought animals and people into a closer architectural relationship, while still keeping the house legible as a working whole. It also meant that winter planning could not be separated from animal care so neatly. A wall, partition, or end space might make room for stock without turning the building into a completely different kind of place. Regional variation mattered here because local practice shaped how storage and shelter were combined. What worked in one district did not have to appear in exactly the same way in another. The same broad idea could be expressed through different plans, different proportions, and different emphases. For the household, that meant the building itself answered to the landscape and the custom around it. Storage arrangements were therefore not abstract design rules. They were practical decisions rooted in local ways of making a winter farm function. If one end of the longhouse held animals, the rest of the house had to be organized with that reality in mind. Heat, movement, and supply all became part of a shared interior order. The result was a house that could support more than one kind of life at once, while still keeping the whole farm ready for the cold season. It was a seasonal intelligence built into timber and layout, not just into planning at the edge of the year. That makes the longhouse less like a fixed template and more like a regional tool, adapted to climate, custom, and the household's own winter workload. Storage could also sit near the domestic work area or even within it, depending on how a site is read. That means the practical life of the house did not always divide itself into clean compartments. In a winter settlement, proximity had value. If supplies were near the working core of the household, they were easier to keep in motion as tasks shifted from day to day. Fuel, gear, and other stored goods could remain part of ordinary movement through the building, rather than being hidden away in a separate quarter. That arrangement changed the feel of the house socially as well as practically. The same space could be associated with making, tending, and keeping, instead of with a single narrow purpose. Mixed-use interiors accommodated several kinds of household work. A farm, with storage near its domestic center, did not need to treat preparation as something remote from daily life. Instead, winter readiness lived inside the ordinary rhythm of the building. That kind of plan could make the threshold between work and shelter feel lower, because the supplies for one belonged almost beside the conditions of the other. The house became a place where readiness was visible in the arrangement of rooms, not only in the amount of goods gathered. In that way, storage was also a social order, placing the season's necessities where household life could keep touching them. That closeness also made winter supply feel less like a separate store and more like part of the house's everyday working grammar. Room names in this world were never perfectly fixed, and that is part of the story too. A storage room, a living room, a byre, a stable, a barn, or a rough kitchen could sit close to one another in the mind of a household that used its longhouse flexibly. Because of that, the safest historical picture is not a hard blueprint, but a working interior that changed with local habit and seasonal need. Some layouts placed stores beside daily work, some drew animals into one end, and some gave outbuildings the main burden of reserves. Each arrangement answered the same larger problem in its own way: how to keep a farm ready when the light shortened and the cold hardened the ground. That answer was not merely architectural, it shaped how the household experienced the winter threshold, with supplies already gathered into the spaces that would carry them through. In one place, the arrangement may have looked simple, in another complex, but everywhere it linked fuel, storage, and routine labor to the longhouse itself. So as the season moved deeper, the household did not face the frost empty-handed. It had already translated the landscape into rooms, thresholds, and stored provisions, and that quiet preparation was the beginning of endurance. That flexibility could make a household feel less split between keeping and doing, because the same walls housed both the stored means of winter and the work of using them. In that sense, the longhouse was not only a shelter, it was a seasonal arrangement for carrying provisions forward, one-roomed answer to the coming cold. The Torksey comparison shows that cold weather occupation required organized supplies and repair materials, while rural farm life must remain a separate household context rather than a template. Winter travel on ice and snow made movement harder for people and animals alike. Paths that worked in open weather turned slower, and loads had to be managed with more care once the ground hardened. Even so, frozen ground did not bring movement to a halt. Households still needed to shift goods, keep contact with neighbors, and move what winter work required. Practical adaptations answered that pressure. Traction devices provided better grip on slick surfaces, helping feet or loads hold against the frozen ground. Bone skates offer an interpreted adaptation for movement over ice. Together, these forms of equipment show a season in which winter was not simply waited out, people adjusted to it. That mattered before the frost fully settled, because fuel had to be gathered, cut, moved, and stored while routes were still usable. Winter mobility was part of preparation itself. A household that could keep moving could keep assembling the materials that would make the cold months possible. The frozen landscape narrowed the field of action, but it did not erase it. Instead, it pressed ordinary movement into more exact and more deliberate form, so that each trip across hard ground carried a wider weight than it would in milder weather. That continuity made the difference between a season endured and a season managed. The work was practical rather than dramatic, but it shaped what could be brought home and set aside before the cold tightened its hold. In that way, winter travel belonged to the making of fuel as much as to the movement of people, because both depended on the same narrow openings in the season. It was a small adjustment, repeated often, and it kept the household's winter work from stalling. A mountain shelter offers a useful comparison for the cold months. Its hearth and benches outline the simplest kind of winter lodging, warmth gathered in one fixed place, and resting places arranged so people could pause without building a full home around the stop. The arrangement was spare, but it was enough for weather that punished movement and made every halt matter. A hearth gave a stable center for heat and for daily attention, while benches marked a space for settling in. Read beside winter travel, the shelter shows how narrow the line could be between road and room. Outside, frozen ground demanded traction devices or bone skates. Inside, a fire and a small ordered space defined what could be used. For a household preparing fuel before the frost, that contrast had plain force. Stored wood and other fuel supported cold season household use. The shelter does not describe a farmstead directly, but it does show the practical clarity winter required: a compact space, a dependable source of heat, and enough arrangement to keep life going until conditions changed. Fuel storage belonged to that same logic. What had been gathered in better weather had to be kept dry, close, and ready. Winter rewarded that kind of discipline. It favored short distances, reliable access, and a layout that left less to chance. The hearth and benches therefore stand for more than comfort. They show a season in which warmth was organized, not assumed, and in which every usable space had to earn its place against the cold. Winter did not only make roads harder, it also altered what kind of work made sense at the edge of water and ice. Winter fishing may also have been one seasonal tactic. The cold months changed the balance between land and shore, and they made some forms of gathering more practical than others. That simply shows that the same weather that slowed hauling could still support another kind of food getting. For households preparing fuel before the frost, such a pattern mattered because survival depended on more than stacked wood. Stored warmth, dry fuel, and access to working ground were all part of the same seasonal calculation, but so was the ability to keep food coming from more than one direction. The result was not a single winter routine, it was a collection of small decisions, each tied to what the season allowed. A frozen landscape could interrupt ordinary movement and still leave room for deliberate use of its hard surfaces and edges. That is why winter adaptation mattered so much. It was never only about waiting for cold to pass. It was about finding the few practical paths that remained open, whether underfoot, beside the shore, or on ice. In that sense, every useful method shared the same quiet aim, carrying the household through a season when easy movement had gone and every supply had to last. The season encouraged caution, timing, and modest ambition rather than broad movement across the land. That restraint shaped winter work because the line between what could be done and what had to wait grew tighter as the frost deepened. Even then, the household kept adjusting, one useful choice at a time. Torksey offers a sharper comparison here. Temporary accommodation and repair needs there point to winter logistics as a matter of maintenance, interruption, and quick adjustment, the kind of planning that lets movement continue without pretending it is settled life. The shelters were temporary by design, and that ephemerality matters. They show a system concerned with keeping people housed just long enough to restore what winter or travel had worn down. Read that way, they illuminate logistics more than they describe a permanent household. A farmstead is not a camp, and the arrangements of winter around a household carried different obligations, even when they drew on the same broad logic of shelter, storage, and repair. Still, the comparison is useful because it strips the season down to essentials. In cold weather, staying mobile often meant carrying enough to survive the stop, enough tools to mend what failed, and enough order to move again when conditions allowed. The winter world could therefore be busy without being comfortable, practical without being settled, and demanding without being dramatic. That is the bridge between travel and home, not a grand divide, but a set of repeated adjustments made wherever people and animals had to pause. The same logic appears in the need to keep equipment serviceable, because winter travel punishes anything loose, damp, or neglected. A temporary stop had to support repair as much as rest, and that double duty made logistics the real center of the comparison. It is the difference between merely stopping and remaining capable of starting again after frost and road both turn reluctant. That mattered in winter. The clearest social effect of all this was continuity. Frozen ground did not end movement, it changed its cost and made every passage matter. Households that adapted kept ties alive across winter, and that mattered for more than one kind of exchange. Roads, tracks, and shorelines became narrower channels rather than open invitations, but they still carried goods, messages, and the practical business of a season that refused to stand still. Bone skates mark one adaptation for travel over ice, a reminder that people met winter with tools as well as caution. Traction tells the same story. It shows that movement continued across frozen winter ground even when the ground no longer offered an easy footing. That continuity gave winter its shape. The cold did not simply isolate households, it reordered the ways they remained connected. For a household preparing fuel before the frost, the lesson was plain enough. Whatever had to be hauled, cut, or stored depended on keeping some movement possible. Once that effort was done, the season would keep pressing inward, and the work of the home would take on its own slower pace. That quieter discipline carried the household toward the next stretch of winter, where standing still was never the same as being at rest. In practice, winter asked for enough movement to keep obligations in reach, enough order to make hard ground passable, and enough foresight to leave the frost with more than hope. Winter in a household was never evenly shared. Standing shaped how securely a home could meet the cold, because some households had more room, stored goods, and flexibility in arranging them, while others worked within tighter limits. Fuel before the frost therefore belonged to a larger pattern of rank, not to a neutral domestic routine. The same season could feel sturdier in one place and more exposed in another, even before the deep cold arrived. That difference mattered because a household was not only a place of shelter, it was a place where social position set the margin for survival. A winter plan could not be separated from the standing of the people living within it, and the house itself carried that difference into daily practice. In a better provisioned home, preparations could absorb delay and clutter more easily. In household space also served living, working, and sleeping, so the effort of storing for winter began with unequal conditions already fixed by the shape of the household. The cold did not touch every home in the same way, and the difference was already built into the room before the season hardened. Fuel was gathered into homes that were not equally prepared to receive it, and that social difference stayed visible in the way each winter room could hold the season. When the frost came closer, some households still had a margin for sorting and stacking, while others had far less room to spare. The house never erased rank, it gave rank a practical form in the winter months. Scandinavian homes did not follow one fixed room plan. One settlement might set its interior in a broad hall shape, another in a tighter arrangement, and local custom could change across both region and period. Because of that, a winter house from one century or one district should never be treated as the universal answer. The work of preparing fuel could happen inside very different domestic layouts, and the house plan itself shaped what could be stored close at hand. Townhouses offer a contrast, not a countryside model, but they still show how domestic space could be organized in more than one way. The important point is not that every home obeyed one scheme, but that winter life unfolded inside buildings marked by local choice. A room that spread wide allowed a different order from one that narrowed quickly. A later house could answer the same season with another arrangement altogether. Regional habit, changing time, and local practice all moved the plan of the house. The result was not one Scandinavian winter form, but a range of domestic shapes, each with its own way of handling fuel, storage, and movement. Even before any wood or peat was stacked, varying room plans could shape household arrangements. That variety gives the winter home its shape. It also keeps one arrangement from standing for all the others, which never worked that way in practice. The house plan changed the practical meaning of fuel before the frost, and it changed that meaning in ways that varied from place to place and from generation to generation. Some longhouses placed the entrance and the hearth in separate relations, while others did not. That difference changed how the interior was crossed and how work gathered around the center of the building. In one plan, access and warmth could be organized with a little more separation. In another, the house turned more clearly around a shared core. Neither pattern was a universal rule, and both belonged to a wider range of house forms. Occupation could also shape the interior. Certain spaces were divided by the kind of work done there, so storage, preparation, and other household duties did not always occupy the same open stretch. Such division was never a fixed formula, but it did matter when fuel had to be handled before the frost. A pile of wood, peat, or other heating material was not just a reserve for later use, it had to fit into the working life of the building. The structure of doors, hearths, and interior divisions decided how easily that could happen. A house with more separation could keep some tasks from crowding each other. A house with less separation asked several duties to share the same ground. Either way, winter preparation was tied to architecture. The arrangement of the building did not merely shelter people from cold, it sorted the daily pressure of the season into a practical order, and that order began with the way the hearth and entrance met the rest of the house. In some homes, the household could divide use more cleanly. In others, the same interior had to carry more overlap through the season. Some farms included space for livestock within the household layout. When animals occupied part of the same domestic setting, winter planning had to accommodate both human use and animal shelter at once. That changed the meaning of fuel storage, because the available room was not simply empty house space waiting to be filled. It was space already assigned to more than one purpose. Other farms were arranged differently, so it would be wrong to imagine a single farmstead form. One layout left broader passages and clearer margins for stacking fuel. Another compressed several purposes into a tighter interior. Those differences created different levels of winter ease, even among houses of similar standing. The presence of livestock space did not make one farm identical to another, and it did not erase the variation already built into Scandinavian domestic life. Instead, it shows that winter preparation belonged to a whole pattern of household ordering. Heat, storage, work, and shelter were not separate questions. They pressed against one another in the same structure. A household with animals under its roof had to settle that pressure in one way. A household without them could settle it in another. Fuel before the frost therefore rested inside a wider domestic balance, where the shape of the farm mattered as much as the fuel itself. That balance was local, practical, and never the same twice. In that setting, even a simple reserve of fuel carried the imprint of the layout around it, because room, passage, and use all had to make room for one another. Fuel storage never stood apart from the rest of it. For that reason, any reconstruction should preserve variation instead of flattening the winter house into one tidy plan. Some homes gave more separation, some less. Some linked work and dwelling more tightly, some more loosely. Some included livestock space, others did not. Regional change and chronological change altered the arrangement as well, so the houses of one place or century cannot stand in for all the rest. Each household remained a local arrangement, shaped by region, time, and use, rather than by any single house form. No single plan can flatten those household differences without losing how winter worked for households. Put together, these patterns leave a clear historical picture. Winter fuel was gathered for the cold, but the house determined how that fuel could be held, reached, and fitted into daily life. That is the cleanest way to carry the season forward. A single scheme would blur the differences that made each household distinct, while variation keeps the winter household legible as a set of local answers. The next part begins only after that point stays fixed. The house was not a frozen template, and the way it handled fuel before frost was one more expression of its own order. The safest picture keeps every arrangement in play. A home might separate entrances, hearths, or working spaces. Another might bring those functions together. Some farms folded animals into the same structure, while others did not. Across region and time, the plan kept changing. Fuel before frost belongs inside that shifting pattern, and the house decides how it lives there. That point carries the season forward. Regional house forms also reflected varied resources and social conditions. Before the frost settled in, winter readiness was already pulling the household into a single task. Storage had to be arranged with care, the building needed repair, and shelter itself had to be made serviceable because each part depended on the others. A farm household could not treat fuel as a separate concern from the roof above it or the walls around it. The same winter work belonged to households with different ranks and different holdings, and it looked different where timber was plentiful, where stone was more common, or where other materials shaped the farmstead. In one place, the answer might lean on what the land supplied nearby. In another, it might reflect what a household could afford to gather, trade for, or reuse. So the season began not with a single grand project, but with a practical alignment of people, buildings, and supplies. That readiness was shaped by region, status, and available material, and those pressures worked together rather than separately. If the household was going to keep steady through the cold months, fuel had to be part of the wider arrangement that made the whole place winter-ready. The work reached from the storage place to the structure itself, because dry supplies only stayed useful when the building around them stayed sound. Winter preparation therefore joined repair and shelter to the question of what would burn, what would last, and what the household could keep in reserve. The household's cold season planning therefore started as a linked set of choices, each one limited by the place itself and by the labor already available. Winter readiness also had a clear practical core because storage, building repair, and indoor work all belonged to the same season. Dry fuel had to be kept in order, but so did the things that protected it, from doors and walls to the roof and the spaces where work moved inside. A farmstead that expected the cold season could not leave every task outside. Some labor moved indoors because weather made that choice sensible, and because the season made time for maintenance that summer had crowded out. Tools, hides, cloth, food stores, and other working materials could all be sorted and handled under cover while the weather hardened outside. The household therefore treated winter as a time for keeping the place running, not as a pause in effort. Fuel preparations sat inside that larger rhythm, alongside the routines that kept supplies dry, secured, and ready for use. In that sense, the cold months were anticipated through work already underway before the first hard freeze arrived. A household that stayed organized before winter was already preserving its working capacity for the weeks ahead. Once the weather turned, repair and sorting no longer waited for comfort or convenience, and the household used the season to keep its working surfaces in order. Dry supplies, damaged building fabric, and weathered timbers all belonged to the same round of attention because a cold month rewarded nothing that had been left neglected. Winter asked for maintenance before it asked for endurance. That discipline gave the household a steadier winter and kept the building from becoming a burden when the cold months lengthened further. No single Viking farm plan can cover every winter household because local resources mattered more than any fixed template. Where woodland was close, fuel could follow one pattern. Where the landscape offered different materials, the household adapted to that setting instead. Status also mattered, since larger holdings, smaller farms, and households with different access to labor could not organize the season in identical ways. Some places had room for broader storage and more substantial buildings, while others had to make do with tighter arrangements and fewer reserves. That variety should not be treated as a flaw in the picture. It is the picture. Winter readiness was always specific to the land underfoot and the people who worked it. The same need could lead to different answers because a farm household was shaped by what was available nearby and by what could be maintained year after year. In practice, that meant the fuel question belonged to a wider local balance of supply, shelter, and repair, rather than to one frozen design that every farm simply copied. The household did not borrow a universal winter script. It worked with what the place allowed and with what the year had left in hand. A coastal farm, an inland holding, and an upland settlement did not reach the same answer by the same route. The available ground, the nearby timber, the labor on hand, and the household standing all shaped what could be done before the freeze. Different answers were answers to the same season, specific to place. Winter readiness, therefore, belongs to local history, not to one model that pretends every farm looked alike. A house biography could shift function over time, and that mattered when a household prepared for winter. A building was not always a static shell with one permanent use. As years passed, rooms could be rearranged, repaired, enlarged, or assigned new roles, so the way a house handled storage and work could change with it. Regional house biographies show that building arrangements changed by place and period, which means the winter farmstead did not stand still from one generation to the next. A house that had once served one pattern of living could take on another as the household, the land, or the local economy changed. That is why the winter task cannot be reduced to a single floor plan or a universal sequence of repairs. The same structure might carry different habits of use across time, and those changes shaped how fuel, supplies, and indoor labor were organized before cold weather took hold. Read in that way, the house becomes part of the season's history. Its altered uses show how preparation was never only about what lay outside the door. It was also about how the building had been shaped and reshaped by earlier needs. Over time, that kind of change could alter where a household kept things and how the building divided work from storage. A house repaired for one phase of life could be used differently in the next without losing its earlier shape entirely. Each adjustment left another layer in the house biography, and those layers help explain why regional arrangements do not line up into one tidy sequence. The structure carried its past into every season. Comparisons from towns, shelters, and camps must remain separate because each setting followed its own logic. A farmstead was not a market building, a temporary shelter, or a camp, and its winter preparations should not be blended into one tidy pattern. Even where the broad needs overlapped, the setting changed the answer. Local resources set the terms, and the household worked within them. That is the most useful way to understand the fuel work before winter, not as an abstract rule, but as a practical arrangement shaped by place, rank, material, and the changing life of a building. The result was a seasonal threshold that had been crossed in labor before the weather made it obvious. By the time the cold settled deeper, readiness had been made in the background through storage, repair, and the adjustment of the farm to what its own ground could support. Winter could then arrive without turning the farm into something new. It simply revealed what had been organized with care. Town buildings, temporary shelters, and camps can help clarify the range of winter practice, but only if they stay in their own categories. A farmstead answered to a different rhythm of repair, supply, and labor, and the comparison works only when that difference stays visible. What matters here is the fact that local conditions set the limits and the household shaped its winter around them. By the time cold took hold, the difficult work was embedded in the place itself. That is the ending of preparation, a settled arrangement that had made room for the season before the weather announced it. Inside a winter longhouse, the central hearth made the room legible. It gave warmth to the people gathered near it, threw light across the working space, and supported the cooking that had to happen indoors when the season turned hard. The fire did more than answer hunger or cold. It organized the day around a shared center. Tools, benches, and sleeping places belonged to a building that was not divided into many small rooms, so the hearth became the point from which activity could spread and to which it could return. In that sense, the fire held together the practical life of the house. When the weather closed in, the longhouse did not become a sealed refuge in the modern sense. Instead, it relied on one place that could serve several jobs at once. Heat, light, and cooking heat came from the same core, and that arrangement made winter living possible without turning every task into a separate indoors core. You can imagine the room not as a private corner for each need, but as a working interior where the hearth remained the most useful feature through the dark months. That practical arrangement also meant that people moved toward the same bright center for the ordinary business of the house, and the room's shape followed that habit rather than resisting it. So work, rest, and food all gathered under one roof in a way that suited winter life and kept the longhouse usable when hearth light supported indoor work and the cold pressed in. The hearth was not an afterthought at the edge of the longhouse. Where documented, a central hearth belonged to the built interior, a fixed piece of equipment around which the interior was organized. Because it could warm people, light work, and support cooking, it carried several forms of use without needing several separate installations. That combined purpose shaped the room, the floor, the circulation, and the available space all made sense in relation to the fire. At the same time, the hearth was more than a practical appliance. It marked the domestic center of the house, the place where ordinary life had its most obvious anchor. In homes of this kind, domestic activity did not hide in a kitchen corner far from the rest of the building. It clustered near the main fire, where warmth and illumination were available together. The result was a house whose central feature was also its working heart. Once the hearth had that position, every other arrangement in the room had to take it into account, from where people could stand or sit to how broad the open interior needed to remain for the tasks the household had to manage. That is why the hearth should be pictured less as a single object than as the longhouse's organizing principle, the place where heat, light, and labor were gathered into one working center, and where the room's design quietly announced that winter survival depended on shared use rather than divided space in the cold months. Above all, the same hearth that made winter life possible also brought a trade-off. Longhouses had smoke and ventilation limitations around their hearths, so the air inside could stay less clear than anyone would prefer. Limited ventilation could leave smoke inside longhouse interiors, and that affected how the room was used. A fire that warmed and lit the house did not simply disappear at the roofline. It asked the building to accommodate it. Openings and airflow had to do their work without turning the house into a drafty shell, which meant the interior lived with some smoke as the cost of keeping heat in. That condition helps explain why the hearth was never just a decorative center. It was a working center that shaped movement, attention, and the placement of daily tasks. People in the house had to live with the fire's advantages and its limitations together. In a winter setting, that balance mattered more than the idea of perfect comfort. The longhouse was built to hold warmth, not to erase every inconvenience, and the hearth sat at the middle of that compromise. So the hearth also disciplined the room, making people share air, light, and attention in a way that tied the household together, even when the smoke made the interior less comfortable than the warmth made it useful. That trade-off was ordinary for a dwelling of this kind, and it belonged to the season's practical order rather than to any special hardship. It simply came with keeping people and fire together. The hearth also gave the longhouse a social shape. The fire functioned as a focus for domestic activity, so people were not merely keeping warm around it, they were sharing a center that ordered the room's everyday life. That social role belonged to the same central fire that supplied light as well as warmth and cooking heat. It did not have to be grand to matter. In a house built for shared survival, the place that supported ordinary tasks also carried ordinary company. Traveler shelters offer a useful comparison here because they too used a large central hearth, though for a different setting and with different demands. A mountain shelter's central hearth points to the same broad idea. When people are moving through severe weather, one fire can serve cooking and warmth at once, and its position helps gather the whole interior around it. The longhouse followed that wider logic while remaining a home rather than a way station. Its hearth bound daily labor to shared space, so the room's social life and its practical life were never far apart. In winter, that sort of arrangement was not an ornament. It was the household's habit of staying together in the plainest possible way. Even the limitations of the interior belonged to that pattern, because everyone who used the fire also accepted its shared center as home. That same habit made the hearth feel less like an object than like the house's steady communal center, private and public at once. Because the hearth carried light and heat together, it also made indoor work more continuous. Tasks did not stop at sunset simply because winter closed in. They shifted into the space the fire could reach. That mattered in a longhouse with smoke and ventilation limitations around its hearths, since the building could not erase the consequences of using one fire for so many purposes. The interior therefore became a place of managed compromise. people had to keep enough openness for movement and enough shelter to hold warmth, and the hearth stood at the center of that balance. The result was a practical domestic order in which the shared fire helped define what could happen comfortably inside. It is easy to focus on the fire as a source of heat, but its greater importance may have been that it gathered necessities into one arrangement. Light, warmth, cooking heat, and common use all came together there, and that combination made winter living feel organized rather than improvised. In this kind of house, the central fire was not simply a means of survival against the cold. It was the room's main reference point, the thing that allowed a scattered set of needs to stay aligned in one indoor space. That alignment gave the household a steadier rhythm without pretending that the season had become easy. Its calm usefulness was the point, and the room could keep working even when the fire had to do more than one job at once for the sake of winter. By the time winter settled deeply over the longhouse, the hearth had already done the quiet work of making the interior understandable. It warmed the people within reach of it, lit the tasks that had to continue, and supported cooking from the same central place. It also gave the room its social center, so that domestic activity clustered where the house was brightest and most usable. Even with smoke and ventilation limits, the building kept faith with that arrangement because there was no better way to hold warmth and work together. The fire therefore stood at the meeting point of survival and routine, which is why it mattered so much in ordinary seasons as well as harsh ones. A traveler shelter and a mountain shelter remind us that this logic was not unique to one kind of building, yet the longhouse gave it a settled home rather than a temporary stop. In the house, the hearth did not just help the winter pass, it framed how winter was lived. That frame remained in place after the first days of cold had gone by, after the room had lost its novelty, and after the household had stopped thinking of the fire as a feature and started relying on it as part of the house itself. From there, the season could continue its inward turn, with the hearth still holding the center. The next concerns of winter would gather around that same center, but here the house has already found its first steadiness. Inside a longhouse, winter warmth began with a compromise. The hearth opened the room to heat, but the room also had to breathe, so smoke and ventilation limits shaped how longhouses actually worked. The building was not a sealed chamber, ventilation remained limited, and smoke conditions varied across reconstructed interiors. Warmth gathered where the fire made it, while the air nearer the edges stayed different. Comfort therefore depended on arrangement, not even spread. The center could be the most usable place, but it was also the place where smoke had to be managed. A winter house needed to hold heat without letting the room become unlivable, and that balance set the terms for daily life. The longhouse was thus a working environment shaped by flame and ventilation together. Its winter usefulness came from allowing heat to remain available while still giving smoke a path upward and outward. That made the hearth more than a source of warmth. It made the entire interior a negotiated space, where the ceiling, the roof, and the open air above mattered as much as the fire below. The room's pattern of use grew from that basic constraint and from the fact that cold and smoke were always present together. That arrangement meant the house was measured less by floor than by the band around the hearth, where heat, draft, and smoke remained in uneasy balance throughout winter. Wall benches gave the room a second layer of usefulness. In some houses, the benches offered places for sitting or sleeping near the heated interior, so the edge of the room became part of the living plan rather than a dead margin. Near the fire, heat was strongest. Along the wall, the bench line gave a person a place within reach of warmth, without standing in the busiest ground of the hearth. That mattered because the floor held movement, work, and circulation, while the walls could carry steadier uses. The bench was not a decorative addition. It helped the house hold together as winter living stretched on, because the same interior had to support rest as well as activity. In some houses, Wall benches provided places for sitting or sleeping, and that made the longhouse less dependent on a single central posture around the fire. The building could gather people at the middle while still giving them a resting edge. Such a layout turned the wall into a usable zone, one that softened the distance between the hottest center and the colder floor. It also gave the household a way to keep the room orderly without breaking it into smaller chambers. In that sense, the bench line was part of the house's own discipline. It made the interior broader in function while keeping the same basic enclosure. Winter comfort did not come from eliminating cold, but from placing bodies where the house could support them best through the season. The same smoke that limited the room also shaped how comfort felt inside it. Open hearth smoke made comfort uneven even in well-used homes, so warmth could not be assumed to fill the whole interior evenly. The hearth created a center of usefulness, but the air above and around it did not behave as a single calm space. Some places near the fire were better suited to staying there, others remained less comfortable, especially where smoke gathered or air moved less kindly. That unevenness gave the household a practical map. People could not treat every part of the room as equal, and winter life became a matter of knowing which places were better for sitting, waiting, or passing through. The bench line mattered here too, not only because it offered a place to rest, but because it sat within the same smoky field as the hearth and helped turn discomfort into an organized pattern. Comfort was therefore relative, not absent. A smoky room could still support daily life, but it did so by ranking spaces rather than smoothing them out. That ranking was built into the house itself. The center, the edge, the floor, and the breathing roof each carried different conditions, and the longhouse made use of those differences. A home like this was not warm as a room heated evenly from wall to wall. It was warm in a negotiated sense, with the best places reserved by the shape of the building and the movement of the air. Other houses and shelters also relied on benches or open fires, which shows that the longhouse belonged to a broader pattern of practical interiors. The same simple elements could make an enclosure usable without demanding a fully separated hearth room. In that wider world, a bench could extend the living edge of a room, and an open fire could anchor daily use even where smoke remained part of the experience. The longhouse was not unique in that respect, but it joined a family of domestic spaces that handled winter by placing heat in the open and shaping behavior around it. Within the longhouse, that meant room functions were not locked into separate compartments. Sitting, resting, and household activity could share the same interior, even if the exact division of uses was not fixed from one house to another. What mattered was the practical order produced by the room itself. A household could gather near the center, use the wall edge, and keep the open floor available for movement and work. That flexibility did not remove smoke or cold, but it made the house adaptable. Winter living depended on that adaptability because the room had to answer more than one need at once. The hearth and the bench lined together created a setting that could carry ordinary life through the season without asking the building to become something other than a longhouse. This flexibility made the room ordinary, durable, and useful for shared domestic life in winter for many homes. Later heating studies make the longhouse easier to picture, but they also show how much depends on the model chosen. Heating studies show that reconstruction choices change how smoke is understood. A higher opening, a different roof pitch, a shifted hearth, or another fuel arrangement can change the way smoke moves through the interior. That means the same building form can seem either more tolerable or more troublesome, depending on how it is rebuilt. Experimental heating and smoke trials test reconstructed buildings rather than specify historical routines, so the point is not a single exact household schedule. The point is the way a design behaves when heat is set loose inside it. Those studies make ventilation, height, and layout visible as linked parts of one system. They show why a winter house cannot be judged by the hearth alone. The roof opening matters, the air path matters, and the size of the room matters as well. Each choice alters how long warmth lingers and where smoke gathers. In that sense, the room emerges as a set of working possibilities rather than a fixed arrangement. The house is read through its tendencies, where heat collects, where air escapes, and what sort of room remains usable after the fire is lit. That is why the longhouse cannot be reduced to a single smoke pattern. The result is a room understood through movement, not stillness alone. That kind of reading keeps smoke tied to design, not to a single remembered household routine alone. In the end, the longhouse hearth worked because the building accepted its own limits. Smoke could not be erased, so ventilation was limited and smoke could remain inside. Heat could not spread evenly, so the room made useful places at the center and along the wall. Wall benches turned the edge into a steady part of domestic life, while the open hearth kept the house dependent on a managed flow of air. The result was a winter interior that stayed legible even when it was not comfortable in a uniform way. That legibility mattered. It gave the household a dependable pattern for living with cold, fire, and shared space. The room did not need to be sealed to be workable. It needed only to keep warmth available and smoke tolerable enough for ordinary use. The house did that by joining shelter to ventilation and by letting people occupy the spaces the building could best support. That is why the hearth was more than a fire pit. It was the point at which the whole winter arrangement held together. Around it, the house organized warmth, rest, and movement in a way that suited the season. The rhythm was plain and durable, and it did not depend on spectacle. It depended on a room that could breathe, and on a household that lived within that breathing pattern. When the fire stayed central, the longhouse stayed usable, and winter passed through it in an ordered way through the cold months ahead. Smoke and limited ventilation shaped reconstructed longhouse interiors without defining one universal household arrangement. In the longhouse, winter life gathered around the same heat that cooked the day's food and kept the household work moving. Meals did not sit apart from labor. The hearth made a common center where bread, porridge, beer, and other ordinary cereal preparation belonged to the same domestic rhythm as mending, sorting, and other steady tasks. That arrangement mattered because the building was not only a place to sleep after dark, it was a working interior, and warmth gave that interior a practical shape. In a season when the outdoors narrowed, the heated space allowed the household to keep going without treating cold weather as a pause. Food could be prepared while other work continued nearby, and the same heat that softened the edge of winter also made the room useful in a larger way. A household did not have to split itself into a cooking corner and a separate resting place. The shared center brought those activities together, and that simple arrangement helped the longhouse remain a lived-in workplace rather than an empty shelter from the cold. The longhouse therefore joined eating and making in one room of activity, so the fire was not just for supper, but for the ordinary business that kept family life ordered from one day to the next. Even household routines benefited from that arrangement, because the same room served practical needs. In winter, warmth did not comfort. It organized the day, letting the longhouse hold together as a place where work and eating belonged to the same rhythm. Winter did not silence the making of cloth. Inside the longhouse, wool spinning, sewing, and weaving could continue while the weather stayed hard outside. Those tasks fit the season because they asked for patience more than open air, and they belonged to the same domestic order as cooking and storage. Textile production was not a special display set apart from ordinary life. It was part of the regular household round, folded into the hours around the hearth, and carried by the same people who managed other daily duties. That is part of what made the winter room so useful. It let work happen where warmth already gathered. A length of yarn could move toward cloth without forcing the household into separate workshops or idle waiting. The longhouse could therefore support a rhythm in which spinning, mending, sorting, and food preparation all formed indoor tasks, and that kind of overlap suits a household that shared its labor rather than dividing itself into isolated specialists. In such a setting, the making of clothes was not merely seasonal survival, it was one of the basic things a home did, as normal as tending food and as steady as keeping the fire useful. Textile work could continue indoors during the cold season, and the room around the hearth made the time workable. In practical terms, the household did not need a public workshop to make winter cloth. It needed hands, fiber, and a warm room, and the longhouse gave all three a place to meet. That shared room also shaped how people lived together. In a winter household, daily tasks likely passed from one pair of hands to another rather than being sealed off in separate corners of life. Cooking, mending, weaving, and storing all belonged to the same domestic flow, so the house itself encouraged cooperation. No one needed to be alone with each job for it to count. The hearth made a place where labor could be visible and ordinary at the same time, which matters because household life was not organized around privacy in the modern sense. It was organized around use. When the room supported several kinds of work, the people inside could share the burden of keeping the home running. A person attending food did not stand outside the world of textile making, and someone handling thread did not stand outside the world of household care. Those overlaps made the longhouse feel less like a row of separate lives and more like a common schedule held together by heat, routine, and mutual dependence. That does not require imagining a tidy division of roles. The point is simpler. The winter interior gave related jobs a single place to happen, and that single place made cooperation natural. Around the hearth, the household could remain one working unit rather than several isolated workers under the same roof. That mattered because shared work also shaped shared knowledge, letting each task remain part of household memory rather than a private craft, and it kept winter from turning inward into silence. Beyond the fire itself, the longhouse had to handle the practical weight of a winter day. Cooking did not stand alone, and neither did storage. The same heated interior could hold food preparation, keep tools and materials close, and give the household a place to manage what had to stay inside during the cold months. Spinning, weaving, cooking, and storage all belonged to that indoor household activity, and together they show a home working through winter as a single system. The room was not designed for one purpose only. It had to receive several at once, which is why the hearth mattered so much. Warmth made the space useful enough for routine movement between tasks, and that usefulness turned the longhouse into a kind of domestic hub. A household could sort, stack, measure, and prepare within the same broad interior where the fire stayed central. That arrangement made winter less about endurance in separate stations and more about orderly circulation through the shared room. The same place that supported meals also supported the work that meals depended on, because food, tools, and woven goods all needed a stable place in the house. In that sense, the heated room did not simply make people comfortable. It gave the winter household a workable interior, one capable of holding the practical responsibilities of the season without breaking them into fragments. That is why textile production appears alongside other routine chores rather than standing apart as a winter occupation. It belonged to the house, not to a separate room. Textile production appears as ordinary domestic labor in the winter house. It was not exceptional enough to separate from the rest of the day. The same hands that handled wool or thread also managed other household concerns, and that mixture tells of a home where making cloth was woven into the practical business of living. Even the pieces that survive from that world tend to be small and scattered, with tools and textile traces appearing in a way that keeps the larger pattern understated. That does not make the work less important, it makes it feel familiar, because ordinary labor usually leaves a modest mark. A winter household lived by these repeated acts, not by grand episodes. When the room around the hearth supported spinning or sewing, it also carried the quieter social habit of working alongside one another. The result was a domestic world in which making, mending, and storing blended together so naturally that no one part needed to announce itself. That low-key character suits winter life inside a longhouse. The household did not have to turn cloth making into a ceremony. It could treat it as a normal part of keeping the home ready for the season, and that normality is exactly what the few traces of textile work suggest. A practiced routine, small in individual moments, but steady enough to matter every day. The surviving textile fragments and tools are modest, but they still point toward that everyday order with quiet persistence from one winter to the next. By late winter, the longhouse had made its pattern clear. The hearth was not only a place for heat, but the common point from which the household's ordinary day could unfold. Food preparation, textile work, and storage belonged inside that same shared order. That is why the room mattered practically. It held people together in a working relationship, and it kept the winter household from fragmenting into unrelated acts. A shared fire could support more than a meal. It could support a way of living in which tasks overlapped. Responsibilities moved easily from one person to another, and the house itself gave shape to cooperation. In that setting, warmth was never separate from labor. It made labor possible, and the labor in turn gave the warmth its daily purpose. The longhouse therefore stands as a winter interior defined by use, not display. Its importance lay in the ordinary sequence it preserved: fire, work, food, and the steady human company of a household carrying on together. When the cold season pressed hardest, that pattern gave the home a way to continue, and it carried the household forward with a discipline that did not need to announce itself. It is a kind of continuity, but winter life depended on exactly that: a house that could gather work, food, and warmth into one dependable place, then keep going as the season moved on. That steady pattern kept daily life moving without needing a separate place for every task or every season alone. Winter in a longhouse did not make every interior equal. Household experience varied by status, and that difference showed in how people met the season under one roof. Some spaces sat nearer the center of heat and activity, while others lay farther from the most favored places. The contrast was not only about comfort, it also reflected the way a household arranged itself through rank, labor, age, and obligation. A hall built for shared life could still distribute ease unevenly, and that unevenness belonged to winter life as much as to summer work. The important point is that social order entered the house through placement, not only through speech or rule. A winter interior could therefore feel more open to some and more constrained to others within the same broad culture. That difference did not require a rigid household script. It could arise from the ordinary ways a family, retinue, or working household arranged itself around heat, access, and routine. In that sense, the building carried hierarchy into daily life without turning every relation into a fixed arrangement. When cold weather kept everyone inside for longer stretches, the house made those distinctions harder to miss. What looked like one enclosed space from outside was in practice a set of uneven places, each carrying a different weight in winter use. That pattern mattered most when the outside world narrowed to weather, darkness, and hard routine, because then small differences in placement became part of how the household understood itself and its own order. Architecture can show social difference without turning the household into a single social script. Posts, wall length, bench arrangement, and access to the central hearth all shaped where people could spend time and how a hall organized its priorities. A building for display, storage, work, and sleep did not hand out comfort in equal measure, and its geometry could suggest rank as clearly as any spoken rule. Yet that same arrangement left room for kinship, labor, age, and obligation to operate at once, so one roof carried several forms of order together. In that sense, social position was built into the hall through placement and access rather than through a simple ladder of command. A longhouse could therefore register difference while still serving a household that was held together by shared dependence. The arrangement of solid timber, open space, and favored surfaces made some places more central than others, and those distinctions mattered most in winter, when the hall became the main setting for daily life. What counted was not a perfect plan, but a working one. Built form made hierarchy legible while still allowing a house to function as a place of labor, gathering, and rest from one household to the next through the season. That is why winter interiors should be read as structured environments rather than neutral shelters. Their shape carried social meaning into ordinary use, and that meaning was especially visible where access to heat and room in the hall were not distributed the same way. Some longhouses separated occupational spaces, entrances, or hearths, and that division changed the way winter life moved through the building. An entrance at one end, a hearth set apart from another area, or a space tied to a particular occupation could help a household keep work from crowding the whole hall at once. That mattered because winter living was not only about resisting cold, it also had to give labor, movement, and rest different places to happen. A room or bay reserved for a craft did not need to dominate the rest of the house, but it could hold tools and activity that belonged there more than elsewhere. A distinct hearth could organize a separate rhythm, and a separate doorway could guide traffic without forcing every task through the same center. The result was a hall that worked in segments even when it still looked unified from the outside. Such separation made household order practical. It helped prevent ordinary labor from pressing into every corner and allowed different activities to keep their own pace. In winter, that mattered for more than convenience, because the building itself had to manage closeness, access, and use all at once. A family, household, or working group could therefore maintain several kinds of space inside one structure, each carrying a different purpose. The longhouse was not a single undivided room, but a sequence of places that shaped how people moved, worked, and remained together through the season without making every activity answer to one center. Domestic space could be organized differently across regions, so one winter hall cannot stand for every household. Some communities favored more segmented interiors, while others worked with broader halls and different balances between living and labor. The same household purpose could be housed in more than one layout, and people learned that arrangement through repeated use. A place for resting, a place for work, and a place for gathering could overlap in one building or remain more distinct in another, depending on local habit and regional practice. Even urban houses show that interior order changes with setting. Port city homes answered to streets, trade, and denser neighboring buildings, while rural halls answered to household labor and seasonal shelter. That contrast keeps the longhouse from becoming a generic old house story. It shows that domestic space was flexible, but not random, and that the same broad culture could produce very different interiors. A winter hall in one region might place stronger emphasis on one open chamber, while another would favor narrower divisions or different access points. Those choices mattered because they shaped how work was seen, how movement was guided, and how one part of the household related to another. Regional variation, therefore, belonged to winter life itself. The house did not only protect its occupants from the season, it translated local custom into daily arrangement, and that arrangement determined what felt central, what felt peripheral, and what felt shared. It could still feel local without becoming uniform from one place to another. A single building had its own life, and that life could change. A longhouse was not fixed at the moment of its first plan. Over time, a hall that began with one emphasis could take on another purpose, and a place once tied to occupation could be folded into a different routine. That is why one building should not be assumed to keep one function forever. Its biography mattered as much as its original design. Winter use could carry forward older arrangements even when later occupants worked the house in new ways, so the structure held more than one phase of household order. A family inherited a place with history, not a sealed pattern. Earlier choices about entrances, divisions, or hearth placement could continue to shape movement and gathering after the first builders were gone. Rebuilding did not erase that memory, it often carried it forward in altered form. A house could therefore preserve some habits while making room for others, and the result was a domestic world with layers. One roof might keep traces of older routines while accommodating newer ones, and those layers affected who felt central, who felt peripheral, and which places carried meaning. The longhouse was therefore a place repeatedly adapted as well as a shelter from winter. Its changing life joined repair, occupation, and daily practice into one built history. That history made the house more than a container. It turned the interior into something shaped again by the people who relied on it. Taken together, these winter arrangements show a household world that was never level. The longhouse gathered people under one roof, but it did not erase rank, region, or change over time. Instead, it made those differences visible in the way space was shaped and used. Some households lived with sharper divisions than others. Some communities preferred more segmented interiors, while others kept broader halls and different balances between living and work. Some buildings changed purpose as they were rebuilt and lived in again. So the winter interior was socially uneven, even within one broad culture. That unevenness did not make the house chaotic, it gave the house a working order. The hearth, the entrances, the partitions, and the remembered life of the building all helped decide who stood nearer the center and who remained farther away. Warmth was therefore arranged as much as it was felt. Across the season, the house carried social difference into ordinary life without turning every difference into a fixed rule. That is what makes the longhouse so revealing. It was shelter, workplace, and gathering place, but it was also a map of relationships drawn in wood, earth, and habit. As winter settled in, the house did not speak in one voice. It held several, and they did not all carry the same weight. That quiet ordering shaped daily life inside the hall, and it remained part of the building as long as winter kept the household together from one generation to the next, through the dark months. Winter food in a Viking household rested on a broad cereal base rather than on one narrow grain. Millet belonged beside rye, barley, oats, and wheat in the crop range, and that mix matters because it shows how ordinary eating began in the field as much as in the kitchen. A household drawing on several cereals had choices when one crop did better than another, and those choices shaped the year ahead. The important point is not a single heroic staple, but a working basket of grains turned to different ends. In a season when the ground offered less, the stored harvest still kept daily life moving indoors. That mix also kept the diet from becoming rigid. One farm or homestead leaned more heavily on one grain, another on a different one, yet the wider pattern stayed recognizably cereal-based. Such variety made winter food less a fixed recipe than a practical response to what had been gathered and saved. In that sense, the household pantry was not merely a storehouse. It mirrored the land around it, and of the decisions made while harvest time still felt generous. By the time the cold settled in, the range of grains already set the limits and possibilities of the table. Even then, the choice of grains stayed practical rather than ceremonial, and that plain flexibility helped a household carry its stores through the dark months ahead, without pretending every board was the same through the long winter months ahead. From those grains came bread, porridge, and beer, the ordinary trio that gave cereal work its full reach. Cereals became bread, porridge, or beer rather than one fixed preparation, so the same harvest moved through several forms without leaving the grain world behind. Bread answered one sort of need, porridge another, and beer another, even when the balance between them differed from place to place. That range mattered in winter because stored food had to support both eating and drinking across long months indoors. Grain was not simply counted in bundles and bins. It also carried labor into each finished form, because preparing cereals as bread, porridge, and beer all turned a single crop into daily use. In that sense, cereals linked field, store, and house more tightly than a one-form staple ever did. A household working with these grains kept its provisions in motion, shifting them into loaves, into cooked dishes, or into drink as need and custom required. The result was not a narrow menu, but a flexible grain economy where the same base ingredients supported several roles. That flexibility made cereal food especially important during the darker season, when every transformed portion helped stretch the harvest further. It also kept food preparation tied to the practical routines of the household rather than to a single special dish. Bread, porridge, and beer therefore stood as different expressions of the same stored grain, each one carrying the season forward in its own way through winter for daily household use. Daily cereal foods did not follow one fixed menu because resources changed what a household relied on. A larger or better supplied household treated grain differently from a poorer one, not because taste alone dictated the choice, but because stores, labor, and priorities shaped the outcome. Some stores moved more quickly into cooked fare, while others lasted longer in reserve, and the balance shifted without changing the underlying pattern of grain-based eating. The result was not random variety, it was a practical spectrum built from access and need. One home stretched grain farther in the form of porridge, another reserved better grain for loaf making, and another kept a broader mix for several uses. The point is that cereal foods answered to the household itself. They reflected the size of the harvest, the demands of storage, and the kind of economy the family sustained through cold weather. That is why winter eating should not be imagined as one settled platter repeated everywhere. It was instead a living adjustment, shaped by what sat in the bins and by what the household kept back for later use. In that way, grain measured more than calories. It measured capacity. Households used varied cereal foods without one fixed rationing strategy, while another divided its cereals differently. Such differences stayed inside a shared cereal world, yet they gave each household its own rhythm of use through the dark months. That pattern kept storage and cooking closely aligned through winter. Wheat occupied a higher status position within that mixed cereal economy, and the rank of the grain mattered because it marked difference as well as nourishment. Not every household handled wheat in the same way, and that is part of the story. In a world of rye, barley, oats, and millet, as well as wheat, the finer grain sat above the rest in social value, even while it remained part of the same broad cereal family. That does not mean wheat stood outside ordinary life. It means its use signaled a more advantaged store of food. The hierarchy was subtle, grounded in the practical fact that not all cereals were equally available or equally desirable for every purpose. Mixed grain use, therefore, carried an internal ordering, with wheat standing out when it appeared. Such an arrangement made the cereal world more than a list of crops. It was also a social map, where choice of grain expressed position without needing any grand display. A household did not have to announce anything loudly for the grain itself to communicate status. In winter, when food stores became visible and necessary, that quiet difference was hard to miss. The higher standing of wheat sat within the same ordinary cycle of cultivation, storage, and consumption, adding distinction to the season's food. When wheat appeared beside humbler grains, it quietly lifted the meals standing without changing the household's basic dependence on cereals. It sat higher, yet still belonged to the same winter grain system itself. Different resources produced different cereal preferences, and that variety is easier to understand when winter food is treated as a set of choices rather than a single rule. If a homestead had one kind of grain in abundance, that grain naturally took a stronger place in cooking and drinking. If another grain was easier to spare, it shaped the daily pattern instead. Preference was therefore not merely about liking one taste over another. It was a practical expression of what the household turned into usable food with the stores and effort available. A mixed cereal economy made those preferences possible without forcing everyone into the same arrangement. One place leaned this way, another that way, and both still belonged to the same larger food world. This helps explain why winter diets differed without becoming strange or exceptional. The differences came from ordinary circumstances. Grain kept its flexibility, but the household decided how that flexibility was used. In one setting, a preference for one cereal reflected abundance. In another, it reflected thrift. In yet another, it reflected the value assigned to a particular kind of bread or drink. None of that required a rigid menu. It required only the steady pressure of resources and the knowledge of how to stretch them. So the cereal table remained adaptable, shaped less by prescription than by the practical range of the store. That flexibility kept the household from depending on a single grain and gave winter food a built-in range for many households. Taken on its own terms, this cereal system made winter household life steadier than a single crop ever did. Stored grain moved through the season in familiar forms, and each form fit a different part of the daily round. The store served ordinary nourishment or waited until the household needed it, according to what had been gathered and kept safe. That steadiness mattered because winter reduced the room for improvisation. A household worked with what had already been gathered, sorted, and kept safe, and cereal foods gave that work practical shape. The result was not abundance for its own sake, it was continuity. Grain remained useful after cutting, threshing, and storage had done their part, and that usefulness kept the household's indoor routines anchored. Preserved grain, once secured, kept ordinary work supplied, while the weather held other tasks back. That practical continuity suited indoor labor, since grinding, cooking, and keeping stores in order belonged to the colder months as much as any single meal did for many households through the season. Different households still looked different because their stores were not equal, but they shared the same broad dependence on cereals. In the cold months, that dependence formed a quiet center for the home. It held the household together through repetition, choice, and restraint, and it left enough room for each store to answer to its own size. Long after the fields were still, the grain continued to do its work inside. That rhythm carried the home through winter. Indoor work remained useful through winter. Winter food in a Viking household did not depend on one single kitchen habit. Grain could be turned into bread, porridge, or other everyday food in more than one domestic mode, and that flexibility mattered when the household stayed indoors for long stretches. Preserved food and indoor work belonged together because the season pushed many ordinary tasks under the roof, where grain still had to be sorted, ground, mixed, and made fit to eat. Some of that work belonged to the hearth, some to a separate surface or vessel, and some to whatever equipment a household actually possessed. In that sense, winter cooking was less a fixed room than a set of practical choices. A family with ample gear could manage one pattern, a smaller farm another. The important point is that the grain itself moved through the household in steps, not in a single finished form. That gave winter food a steady rhythm without demanding a grand installation. Flat breads were part of that rhythm too, and they could be made in a house where no dedicated oven stood ready. A simple meal did not require a specialized baking chamber, only the means to turn grain into something warm, firm, and useful for the day. In a season shaped by storage, thrift, and ordinary repetition, that kind of bread fit the domestic rhythm especially well. It could be baked on or near the hearth, where heat and flat dough met without a later specialized oven changing the pattern. That flexibility helps explain why flat breads belong so naturally to the hearth. A hearth could support baking on or near its heat, and the bread did not have to wait for a separate baking room to exist. In a winter household, that mattered because indoor work had to stay close to the central fire and the tools already at hand. The hearth was not only for simmering or roasting, it also offered a place where grain could be changed into something flatter and quicker than a loave's first ideal would suggest. Flat breads remained possible where a household lacked a dedicated oven, and the absence of that oven did not leave the kitchen empty of bread making. Instead, the household used the forms it could sustain. That is why a simple breadwork pattern fits so well with the larger winter economy of care, storage, and daily provision. It kept grain moving, transformed it into food with manageable equipment, and did so without forcing the farm to imitate a later, fuller kitchen arrangement. The result was practical rather than grand. Bread was still bread, even when made in a low, direct, and unspecialized way. The point is not that every family baked the same sort of flat bread every day. The point is that this style of cooking belonged to the range of ordinary domestic possibilities, and it stayed within reach wherever a hearth could serve both heat and food. That was enough for a household measuring winter by endurance, not novelty. Hearth cooking stayed important because household ovens spread only late, and that late spread belongs in the larger history of domestic change. For a long time, the hearth remained the normal center of warmth and preparation, while a purpose-built oven was simply not part of most households. That matters because later oven use can tempt us to project a more specialized kitchen backward onto earlier farms. In this period, the older arrangement still carried the burden of food preparation. Cooking, baking, reheating, and keeping things serviceable all depended on a flexible central fire rather than on a room organized around one modern-looking appliance. The hearth therefore did more than mark comfort. It stood in for the missing specialization that later households would sometimes add. When oven building spread more widely, it did so after a long dependence on hearth-centered practice, not before it. A winter household could be steady and efficient without resembling a later brick oven kitchen. The older pattern worked because it matched the scale of the household and the available resources. Hearth-centered cooking supported the preparation of cereal foods, so when the hearth did the work of cooking and baking, it was not a temporary compromise on the way to something better. It was the operating system of the house for much of the winter world. That long reliance explains why later oven spread should not be pushed backward into every farm. It belongs to a later domestic world, not the older farmstead rhythm. Cooking methods varied according to household resources and equipment, and that variety shaped what winter work looked like from one farm to another. A well-supplied household could draw on more vessels, more surfaces, and more room to divide tasks. A smaller one had to rely on a narrower set of tools and on the same workspace for several jobs. Neither arrangement was abnormal. Each one simply translated the same broad need into local practice. Grain food was therefore not locked into one recipe for the whole region, even if the underlying principle was familiar everywhere. Some homes could turn grain into a broader range of dishes, others kept to the simpler forms that fit their means. That is why the domestic story is not about one grand culinary system, but about household capability. A winter kitchen was only as broad as the storage, fuel, and equipment that supported it. In one place that might open more options, in another It might keep things plain and efficient. The hearth and its neighboring surfaces handled much of this work because they were adaptable. They could support flat breads, porridges, reheated foods, and other grain-based preparations without asking for a specialized chamber. The result was not scarcity in the thin sense, it was adjustment. Households worked with what they had, and that practical range is the real shape of winter food at home. It also kept grain food practical, which mattered when winter work needed steadiness more than display alone. Household ovens became more common only in later periods, and that chronology matters more than it first sounds. Once ovens spread, they changed the balance of domestic work in some places, but they did not define the older winter house. Earlier farms did not wait around for that development to make grain food possible. They already had the hearth and the means to use it, so the history of ovens spread should not be read backward as if every rural household had been moving toward the same kitchen model all along. That is the easy mistake of seeing later convenience and treating it as earlier normality. In reality, the shift was gradual and uneven. Some households reached a more specialized baking setup only after long reliance on hearth work, while others remained with older methods for longer. The important thing is that the chronology keeps the domestic story honest. It protects the winter household from being made to look more modern than it was. Bread making and heating did not require a later oven culture to be meaningful, and the older arrangement remained fully capable of turning grain into food. In that way, the rise of household ovens marks change, not a missing prehistory. It tells us what eventually became common, not what had to exist from the start. So the later oven belongs to a different domestic horizon, one that should be named after its own time, rather than borrowed into every older farmstead in winter by default. What remains is the practical shape of the bread itself. Hearth baking does not imply a modern oven kitchen, and flatbreads remained possible where a household lacked a dedicated oven. That combination keeps the winter household grounded in its own period, instead of in a much later domestic ideal. The work was modest, but it was not primitive in the careless sense. It rested on a clear fit between grain, heat, and available equipment. A family did not need an elaborate baking chamber to keep bread in the rotation of winter food. It only needed methods that matched the tools it already owned. That is the quiet strength of these indoor routines. They let the household keep moving through the cold months with food that could be made, warmed, and repeated without dramatic change. The hearth did the job because it was already there, and because the house was built around it. So the winter kitchen closes this part of the story with a simple pattern. Preserved food handled the season's pressure, indoor work organized the day, and grain remained ready to become bread in more than one domestic form. From there, the household could turn its attention to the other tasks that winter asked of it. That pattern also explains why grain food could stay ordinary, even in houses without separate baking rooms, while still feeding a winter household day after day. It kept the bread tied to household means, not to a later expectation of specialization. Winter changed indoor labor into part of the season's main work. Wool spinning, sewing, and weaving were common indoor tasks, and they belonged to the ordinary labor of keeping a household supplied through cold months. Local wool and flax furnished much of the clothing people wore, so the cloth on a body often began with material gathered close to home. Clothing production was therefore not separate from domestic life. It was one thread in the larger pattern of household labor, tied to food preparation, fuel management, and the steady maintenance of the rooms where people lived. Yarn had to be drawn out, seams had to be joined, worn pieces had to be renewed, and each task kept clothing in motion through use and repair. Dress was not a fixed possession waiting on a shelf. It was made, altered, and remade inside the same house that also carried other winter needs. Even plain garments represented hours of repeated attention to fibers, thread, and cloth. The work could be taken up in short stretches, fitting among the rest of the day without losing its place in the household pattern. What hung ready, what needed mending, and what returned to use again, all came from the same domestic discipline. Cloth was not a background detail, it was one of the ways a winter household stayed provisioned, patient, and intact, while outdoor work remained difficult through the shorter days of winter. The season gave that work discipline, and the house depended on it. The fire space gave that labor its most practical setting. Sewing and weaving needed light and warmth, and the central hearth supplied both within the working interior of the house. That mattered because winter shortened the useful day, leaving little room for tasks that depended on steady hands and a clear view of thread and fabric. Around the heated center, domestic work could continue after the demands of outdoor labor had narrowed. The room held food preparation, repair, and fiber work together, not as separate trades, but as parts of one household rhythm. This was no isolated workshop. It was the ordinary center of the home, where the same place that served cooking also served the careful handling of cloth. When daylight weakened, the interior still offered enough steadiness for handwork that would have been awkward in the cold. The hearth did more than warm bodies. It extended the usefulness of the house into the evening hours, keeping the room active in a restrained and domestic way. Because the fire was already there, the household did not need a different space for textile labor. The same center could support both meal-making and the slower business of sewing and weaving. That arrangement helped clothing production remain part of daily routine rather than an occasional errand. The room stayed useful because heat and light already belonged to it, and winter work could gather around them without breaking the calm order of the house. It kept clothing labor inside the day itself. What survives from cloth is only a narrow slice of what winter households handled. Small scraps endure more often than whole garments, so the amount of textile labor behind them has to be understood as larger than the surviving pieces suggest. That makes ordinary clothing production look even more central to household life. A home that spun, sewed, and wove its own needs was not dealing in rare luxury. It was maintaining the visible layer of daily comfort, the layer that had to be renewed as sleeves, hems, and edges wore thin. Local wool and flax kept that process close to the house, tying clothing to the landscape around it. The result was a practical cycle rather than a seasonal flourish. Fibers came in, thread was made, cloth was shaped, and garments returned to use until they needed attention again. Because so little of that cloth survives intact, the scale of the work can seem smaller than it was. Yet the household would have known it as a constant obligation, one that touched every winter wardrobe. Clothing did not appear by accident or arrive as a finished background condition. It was made at home and then made again in an unbroken chain of attention. Even a mended edge or reworked seam belonged to the same patient system, where use and repair stayed close together and the ordinary business of dress never fully stopped. That was enough to make even modest garments part of broader household readiness for cold months. Domestic interiors accommodated that continued textile work in an ordinary and workable way. The same room could host sewing, weaving, and the quieter maintenance of clothing, while the season drew people indoors. Because the work fit around the house rather than demanding a separate building, it became part of daily association as well as daily labor. A winter interior was therefore more than shelter. It was a setting where tasks could share space without losing their place in the order of the house. That arrangement helped preserve continuity between daylight and evening, between movement and stillness. What mattered was not speed, but steadiness. Hands could return to cloth after other chores, and the room could keep its purpose while the work advanced in small measures. In practical terms, this made winter evenings less like dead time and more like a period for maintenance and preparation. Clothing, unlike a single meal, had no finish line that mattered on one night alone. It belonged to the longer habit of keeping the household going, which is why it stayed visible inside the house long after outside work had narrowed. The interior thus carried not only heat and food, but also the patient labor that kept bodies covered until spring. Nothing about it needed to be grand, to be necessary. The usefulness lay in its regular return, in the way small acts of making met the pressure of cold and the slow wear of use. It kept repair and continuity close together through winter. Seen from the life of the house, clothing work was not an interruption between more important duties. It was part of the way indoor labor was organized, sharing the same space with food, repair, and the work of keeping warm. Sewing and weaving could continue in the domestic interior without breaking its larger purpose, because the room was built for repeated use rather than single tasks. That made the household itself the unit of production. Not every skill had to be separate or specialized for the work to matter. Some chores asked for strength, others for steady hands and attention, and textile work belonged to the second kind. It suited the winter rhythm because it could be done in stages, picked up again, and carried forward as materials allowed. The result was a practical economy of patience. A household that controlled its own clothing supply also controlled one more part of winter dependence, reducing the need to look outward for every garment or repair. In that sense, the making of cloth shaped how people lived together inside the house. It gave the winter interior a task that was both useful and quiet, and it kept the household occupied while the season still stretched ahead. The work did not need ceremony to matter, it only needed space, time, and the habit of returning to it. In those repeated returns, clothing joined the larger routine of household order, and the indoor world held together through use rather than display. That mattered most. By the time the house settled into its winter pattern, textile work had become one of the ways it answered the season. Wool from nearby flocks and flax from local fields moved through steady indoor labor, turning ordinary materials into the clothing that carried a household through cold months. That movement from fiber to useful cloth was not dramatic, but it was dependable, and dependence mattered. Each stage of the work supported the next, so a house that spun and sewed also kept itself ready for whatever winter still held. The clothing made inside did not stand apart from the rest of domestic life. It belonged to the same practical order as storing food, tending heat, and managing the room where both could happen. Such labor gave the interior a long usefulness, especially when daylight was short and weather set the limits. The house remained active because winter required more than endurance. It required repair, preparation, and the calm repetition of tasks that kept people outfitted as well as fed. In that quiet discipline, the household carried itself forward into the deeper season, with cloth, thread, and care working together. The season did not halt the making of clothing, it gave that making its place, and the house answered by holding the work close, steady, and ready for the days that followed. Each task reinforced the next, and the house stayed whole because no part of routine stood alone. Cloth and thread kept meeting winter demands, one return after another. Clothing varied by sex, age, and status, so winter dress never settled into a single household pattern. A child, an adult, and an elder did not occupy the same place in clothing customs, and rank shaped how much finish a garment could carry. Some households could maintain more layered, more carefully made clothing, while others relied on plainer pieces that still served the season. That difference mattered not as ornament alone, but as part of ordinary social order. In a long winter, dress helped sort people within the home and in the surrounding community without needing a spoken announcement. The household did not dress as a flat unit. It held several positions at once, and clothing helped keep those positions legible. Plainness and refinement could sit side by side, each answering different needs. A garment could warm the body, preserve comfort indoors, and still indicate where a person stood in the household. For that reason, winter clothing belonged to daily life as much as to status. It moved with work, rest, and company, yet it also carried age and rank in its cut, fiber, and finish. No single wardrobe fit every person under one roof, because the household itself contained difference. That difference did not require elaborate display to matter. Even restrained clothing could mark who had more authority, who had less, and who was still growing into a place. In a cold season, those distinctions remained close at hand, woven into the routine of dressing and keeping warm. Material access deepened those differences. Furs and imported textiles were not equally accessible, and winter dress therefore moved along uneven channels of wealth and connection. Some households could draw on better cloth, a finer finish, or materials that had traveled farther than the local field and loom. Others made do with what was already at hand, what could be reused, and what matched a more modest household life. The result was not a simple split between fine and poor, but a spectrum shaped by standing, labor, and local conditions. Clothing could be practical and still reveal how much reach a household possessed. A firmer drape, a more durable surface, or a more costly fiber could point to a different level of access without turning every garment into a declaration. That meant the same sleeve, hem, or lining could signal different household resources from one settlement to the next. That mattered because winter clothing was worn, not stored away for special occasions. What people could gather, mend, or replace influenced how they appeared through the cold season. The same weather did not produce the same wardrobe in every place. One home could keep more options in circulation, while another relied on fewer, harder-worn pieces that had to last. Clothing therefore carried the household circumstances into ordinary life. It showed that warmth itself could be arranged through unequal means. The season did not erase those differences, it made them more continuous, because the garments had to serve again and again under the same hard conditions. Written accounts and pictorial depictions help, but only cautiously. They broaden the range of winter clothing we can place in the north, yet they never pin down a single domestic wardrobe. A hood, sleeve, border, or cloak may fit several settings at once, and the same feature can carry different meanings depending on wearer and occasion. Pictorial clothing depictions require cautious interpretation rather than literal household reconstruction, because a rendered figure can show type without naming a particular family arrangement. That is why broad habits matter more than precise costume lists. The safest reading follows repeated patterns. Adult and child dress differently. Rank affects finish. Fiber choice and trimming can vary with standing, and no one garment tells the whole story by itself. In winter, that restraint is useful. Households lived close together, but clothing did not flatten them into sameness. It let identity remain legible in ordinary life, while still leaving room for variation. A single garment type could travel across settings, just as a simple form could serve more than one person. What stays constant is the social grammar, not an exact outfit. That keeps the focus on how winter clothing functioned, not on turning every surviving depiction into a portrait of one room. The clothing world remains broader than any one drawing or description, and the household beneath it broader still. That wider range matters more than any one surviving outline, because clothing belonged to use, rank, household practice, and seasonal need at once, not to a single fixed costume. Urban domestic life offers a useful comparison, not a rural template. In towns, houses could concentrate people, goods, and display in ways that differed from farmsteads and estate households. Cloth might circulate more easily there, and better access to certain materials could alter how everyday dress looked and lasted. But the city does not dictate the countryside. It shows one path among several, and it reminds us that winter clothing belonged to different living conditions rather than to a single model of home life. Rural households often worked with more local means, more immediate repair, and a tighter link between production and use. A town dwelling could widen the range of material contact, yet the countryside could also sustain its own order through household skill and careful reuse. The comparison is useful because it separates shared need from shared method. Warmth still mattered everywhere, and social legibility still mattered everywhere, but the road to those ends could differ. A more connected urban home might place different cloth within reach than a more local rural one, while still preserving the basic hierarchy between plainness and finish. That difference in route matters. It keeps the countryside from becoming an echo of the market town, and keeps town life from swallowing the countryside into a single story. Winter dress, then, changed with setting, but it did not abandon the larger language of household standing. It remained a practical expression of place, labor, and access, whether the roof stood among streets or fields. Textile access revealed social difference without fixing one household formula. The same winter could therefore hold several clothing worlds at once, each shaped by standing, labor, and the resources a home could bring together. One household might keep a more varied supply in circulation, another a leaner set of garments that had to last and be renewed carefully. That contrast did not create a single tidy scale from rich to poor. It produced practical distinctions that were readable in the fabric, the fit, and the finish. Clothing belonged to the household's public face as much as to its warmth, yet that face changed with circumstance. A family with wider means could present itself differently than one that depended on fewer materials, and neither case erased the work behind the garment. In winter, the wardrobe reflected what a home could gather, preserve, and keep in use. It was shaped by opportunity, but also by restraint. This is why the matter cannot be reduced to one formula. Status mattered, yet household routines mattered too. Local conditions mattered, yet the larger social order still held. The result was a set of working arrangements rather than a single prescribed look. Some clothing carried more finish, some less, and both could remain ordinary within their own settings. That variety did not weaken the social reading of dress. It made that reading more precise because difference lived inside daily use instead of appearing only on special occasions. That everyday variety mattered most in winter. Household material access varied with status and living conditions, so clothing never rested on the same foundation everywhere. A home with steadier means could gather, maintain, and replace textiles more easily than a home under tighter pressure, and that difference shaped appearance as surely as it shaped comfort. Status did not only determine what could be worn, it also affected how clothing looked in ordinary use, from the quality of cloth to the amount of finish a person could keep through the season. Yet the making and keeping of textiles remained household labor. Spinning, weaving, mending, and reworking old garments stayed close to domestic work, regardless of rank. That meant status and labor moved together rather than apart. The more refined appearance of one household did not remove the need for care, and the plainer appearance of another did not remove the work required to sustain it. Clothing was therefore never only consumption, it was production, maintenance, and social positioning in one. The household carried that burden through the winter, translating access into wearability and wearability into appearance. In that sense, winter clothing quietly held the household together. It marked difference without making difference disappear, and it rested on the repeated handling of fiber and cloth inside the home. When the season drew inward, the wardrobe did not stand outside domestic life. It remained part of the ordinary effort that kept a household presentable, serviceable, and distinct day after day until the cold began to ease. That kept the household in quiet winter order. When winter closed around the northern house, keeping animals alive through the cold months became part of the same order that kept people sheltered. In some longhouses, animals were housed at one end of the building, near enough to belong within the winter life of the household. That arrangement did not create a separate world for the livestock. It placed them inside the wider rhythm of the house, where shelter, care, and daily labor had to fit together. The longhouse therefore worked as more than a dwelling. It became a winter structure that could hold different needs at once, including the animals that had to be carried through the season until grass returned. Some families organized that work with stock in the building itself, while others used a different plan, but the possibility of indoor animal keeping changed how the longhouse functioned in cold weather. It meant that the household did not face winter as a neat line between people inside and animals outside. Instead, the house could absorb some of that burden and make the season more manageable within its own walls. The result was a domestic world that stayed active through the cold, with animal care tied to the shape of the building itself. In that setting, the end of the hall could matter as much as the center, because placement inside the house shaped how winter responsibilities were distributed. That placement kept care close, so winter tasks stayed tied to the longhouse rather than elsewhere outside. In some longhouses, the livestock area occupied an end section. That layout gave animal space a defined place inside the structure without fully isolating it from household life. The same roof could contain domestic activities on one side and stock on the other, so the building held both purposes at once. The end section marked off a practical boundary, but it was still part of the hall. Animal space was therefore not always separate from living space. The house could keep difference within a shared interior, with each part serving a different need while remaining under one roof. Mixed-use buildings took this arrangement further by joining domestic and livestock spaces in the same structure. That combination mattered because it made the house itself do the work of division and connection at the same time. It was an organized frame for winter life, with interior space assigned according to what the household had to preserve. A longhouse built this way could keep human and animal needs from competing too sharply for open ground or for heat. The layout made the end of the house productive, since the farthest part could still be useful for animal care. At the same time, the main living area remained distinct enough to keep household routines from dissolving entirely into stock keeping. The architecture therefore balanced separation and overlap. It created a place where winter maintenance could proceed inside one enclosed form, with domestic work and livestock care existing side by side rather than in distant buildings. That arrangement changed winter work by bringing more of it inside a single shell. When animals occupied one end of the building, the household could keep care and shelter closer together. The longhouse then carried part of the burden of maintenance, because animals did not have to be managed in a separate place every time their needs came due. The shared interior also reduced the division between household labor and livestock care. People and stock remained distinct, but the building made their routines intersect. This kind of compression mattered in a season when distance itself could become costly. A household did not gain hours from the plan, yet it could save effort by using one space for more than one purpose. The arrangement also helped explain why winter life in such houses appears so tightly joined. The interior was not a blank room with a single use. It was a working frame in which movement, attention, and upkeep had to be coordinated. Some longhouses did this by placing stock at one end, and some did not, but the practical consequence was clear wherever animals were indoors. The household could preserve a rhythm of care without opening itself as much to the strain of the season. That made the house feel less like a shelter standing apart from work and more like a tool for handling work itself. In winter, that kind of usefulness mattered as much as warmth, because the building had to support the animals that would carry the household into the next season. That winter arrangement never became a single rule across the north. Not every longhouse kept animals indoors, and the pattern stayed regional. In some places, a house included livestock space. In others, the animals remained outside the main living building. Indoor livestock housing was therefore a local possibility rather than a feature of every longhouse. The shared house form did not force the same interior use everywhere. Instead, communities adapted the building to their own habits and their own understanding of winter needs. That difference matters because a broad architectural tradition can still hold several ways of living within it. The longhouse did not erase local practice, it gave local practice a frame. A house in one district could use its end space for stock, while another house of similar general form kept that space for something else, or left animals elsewhere. The season was the same, but the solution was not. Such variation kept winter life from becoming too neat in description. It also makes the longhouse easier to understand as a flexible domestic type rather than a fixed package of rooms. Where animals were kept inside, the building took on one set of responsibilities. Where they were not, the household managed the season differently while still belonging to the same wider world of northern building traditions. The regional pattern, then, was not a flaw in the form. It was part of how the form lived across different communities. That flexibility kept one household from standing as the whole story. Because animals were only sometimes housed at one end, the longhouse never settled into a single social pattern either. The placement of stock inside the hall reflected household choice and local custom, not a universal expectation. Some households folded animal care into the main structure, others left that work elsewhere. Either way, the house remained a place where winter order had to be actively managed. The decision about indoor livestock shaped the way people understood the building. It marked whether the hall served as a shared winter shell for people and animals, or as a dwelling kept more separate from stock keeping. That difference mattered for household identity as much as for labor. A home with animals inside organized its interior around a broader set of responsibilities, while a home without them preserved a different balance of space. The important thing is that neither arrangement was abnormal within the wider tradition. The longhouse could hold both approaches because winter life demanded flexibility rather than a single ideal plan. Even where animals did not come indoors, the household still had to think carefully about shelter, feed, and the route from cold season to spring. Indoor housing was one answer among several, and the answers could vary from one community to the next. That variety kept the longhouse from becoming a rigid template. It stayed a working form, shaped by decisions about how much of the winter burden the building itself should carry. That choice changed the house, but it did not fix one rule. By the time the cold began to loosen, the longhouse had already done the quiet job that winter demanded. Whether animals stood at one end of the hall or in some other arrangement beyond it, the household had carried them through the season and held the building to its work. The point was not a perfect plan, but endurance. A winter house needed to protect living stock, preserve labor, and keep daily care from scattering across the landscape. Indoor animal space, where it existed, helped meet that need by tying livestock to the same enclosed order that sheltered the household itself. Where it did not exist, other arrangements had to shoulder the same responsibility. In either case, the season moved forward because the household kept its animals going until the thaw opened ordinary movement again. That is why these longhouses matter in winter history. They show how a dwelling could stretch beyond simple shelter and become part of the practical system that carried people and animals across the cold months. The house was not fixed in one pattern, and it did not need to be. Its usefulness came from being adaptable enough for local custom, broad enough for domestic labor, and in some places broad enough for livestock as well. As spring returned, the same interior that had held winter care could loosen back toward ordinary household use, and the longhouse could stand ready for the next season. That readiness came from winter discipline, not from any fixed layout alone. Winter care for animals sat inside the ordinary workings of the longhouse. Warmth and smoke moved through the longhouse in ways that suited more than one room use, and that helps picture a building where the household and livestock shared a broad shelter. Within that frame, room use could vary widely. A single space might serve as storage, living space, byre, stable, barn, or rough kitchen, depending on how the house was organized and how it changed over time. That range matters for winter animal care because it places livestock inside the logic of the dwelling rather than outside it. The point is not a fixed blueprint, but a house built to carry several tasks through the cold season. In such a setting, the animal area was part of the household order, not a separate annex with its own life. Its place affected where fodder was kept, where maintenance work happened, and how the interior remained usable while weather closed in. The building had to keep people and animals under one roof without surrendering the room to any single purpose. That made the longhouse a working system, with one zone supporting another. Care for animals until spring therefore began with arrangement. The house had to decide which interior stretch could bear that burden, and how much overlap with storage or cooking the season would allow. That overlap let a rough kitchen or barn sit close to living space without becoming the same room, and it kept animals, tools, and maintenance inside shared space. Layout could sharpen or blur those arrangements. Separate entrances or separate hearths in some houses complicate room division because they make the interior less like a simple line of fixed functions. A building with more than one access point can guide movement differently, and a hearth placed away from the center can shift the sense of where domestic life begins and ends. In practice, that means a room beside warmth is not automatically a human living room, and a room farther away is not automatically an animal pen. The structure itself can nudge the reading in more than one direction. Reconstruction choices also matter here, because a plan that restores one threshold or hearth over another can make an animal space reading seem especially strong. A room that appears clearly ordered on paper may have felt more mixed in use once heat, storage, and circulation were taken together. For winter care, the significance is straightforward. Livestock were housed within a layout that already contained competing routes and functions. That made room division flexible rather than absolute. A partition could organize work without sealing off every use, and a heat source could support several kinds of activity at once. The interior was not a neat grid, it was a set of practical choices held together by the timber frame, the fire, and the work of the season. Such ambiguity is why a careful reading keeps room labels provisional and lets the timber frame, not a tidy diagram, set the limits clearly. Livestock placement remained variable and debated across longhouse interpretations, and that variability is exactly what gives the winter house its human shape. Some arrangements put animals close to the main domestic center, while others move them toward an end or side of the building. Either way, the placement changed how the household used its floor space. A room assigned to animals reduced the area left for general work, yet it also kept livestock inside the household zone where feed, tools, and daily attention could be managed together. A house that kept animals farther from the central activity area created a different balance, with more open room for people and a sharper division of tasks. Neither arrangement is universal. The longhouse could hold more than one practical answer, and that answer could shift with room size, wall lines, and the needs of the season. What mattered was not a single correct position, but the fit between animal shelter and the rest of the building. That fit shaped dung removal, feed storage, and the ease of moving between tasks. It also shaped how crowded or open the house felt during the hardest months. Winter care was therefore not only about keeping animals alive, it was about making the interior workable, while the same roof had to absorb both steady labor and the added weight of stock. The result was an interior where animal care could expand or contract without remaking the whole household, so no single placement fits every house fully. House biographies can shift a space from one use to another, so the longhouse should be understood as a place with a working history rather than a frozen plan. A storage end could later take on animal shelter after repairs or a new partition, and an area once read as a byre might later serve in a more ordinary domestic way. The same frame could carry different arrangements across time without the whole building losing its identity. That matters because winter animal care was never detached from the earlier life of the house. Earlier choices about wall lines, openings, and room use shaped what could be done in the next cold season. A family living inside such a building inherited not only timber and roof, but also habits of arrangement. Separate entrances or hearths, where they existed, added to that inheritance by marking pathways and heat sources that later household use could emphasize or soften. The result is a house that changed through use, repair, and rebuilding while still meeting the demands of winter. Animal care until spring belonged inside that changing sequence. A room could take on one function for a period, then be adjusted when the building was altered or when household needs shifted. The important fact is continuity through change. The house stayed the same enough to shelter the household, yet flexible enough to move its rooms around the demands of the season. Each adjustment carried memory from earlier phases, so the room remained familiar enough. Buyer and stable readings remain debated in room arrangement, and each reading carries a slightly different sense of household order. A buyer suggests livestock folded directly into the everyday life of the dwelling, with animal care standing close to work, storage, and the routines of the family. A stable points toward a more deliberate shelter for animals, one that implies clearer handling and a stronger boundary within the house. The distinction is subtle, but it matters because it changes how the interior is imagined. In a buyer-like arrangement, the household absorbs animal care more fully into domestic space. In a stable-like arrangement, the same house appears more carefully partitioned, with a stronger sense of managed separation. Either way, the building remains a shared system, but the social meaning shifts. One reading stresses closeness and accommodation, the other stresses order and controlled placement. That difference reaches beyond labels. It affects how winter labor is understood, how much room belonged to animals, and how clearly people and livestock were separated in daily life. The house could support both possibilities because it was built for adaptation, not for a single fixed purpose. So the larger conclusion is not that one term wins everywhere. It is that winter animal shelter in the longhouse could be understood through more than one domestic logic, and that logic shaped the rhythm of family life as much as the shape of the floor. That tension helped define how households shared winter work and managed boundaries in daily life. In the end, winter animal care in a Viking longhouse rested on flexibility. Rooms could store, shelter, cook, or house stock, and the same building could carry those tasks in different combinations as the cold deepened and then eased. That is why the exact placement of animals matters less than the longhouse ability to absorb changing use. Separate entrances or hearths could complicate division, while rebuilding could shift a space from one purpose to another. A buyer reading or a stable reading each names one side of that adaptability, but neither exhausts it. What emerges instead is a house that answered winter through adjustment. The household kept animals through the season by working with the interior already at hand, shaping room use to suit feed, labor, shelter, and the pressure of cold. When spring approached, that arrangement did not have to remain fixed. A room could be opened back toward other uses, and a boundary that suited the hard months could lose its force. The strength here lay in that readiness to change without losing identity. It could serve as shelter for life inside the house, then settle into another balance as the year turned. That quiet adaptability is the most stable feature of the winter longhouse, and it is what made animal care possible until the thaw changed the terms again. That shift could reopen storage, ease movement, and let the house settle back into a less compressed pattern of use for a time. Spring eased pressure slightly. By the time winter tightened its grip, keeping livestock alive was no small side duty. It was one of the season's central tasks, and it depended on fodder reserves gathered ahead of time, on steady hands, and on the household's ability to keep working when the ground was cold and thin. In a simple way, the rhythm resembles camp provisioning, yet the farm had to do it for longer and with less room to improvise. Animals could not be left to the season, because a wintered herd or flock meant milk, manure, breeding stock, and the promise of another year. Feed had to be measured out across weeks, not days, and that meant planning before the first hard weather arrived. Every load of hay, every bundle of straw, and every stored cut of fodder belonged to the same argument with winter. The work was never just about one beast in one pen. It was about the whole holding, and about making the household large enough in effort to carry both people and animals through the dark months. By the time the cold settled in, the feeding plan had already become part of daily life, as ordinary and as necessary as any other winter routine. The larger point is simple. Winter feeding was not a narrow chore, but a test of coordination. Someone had to know what was stored, what was thinning, and what could be stretched, so the holding did not spend January feeding February's shortage over and over through winter. Alongside those stores, winter households could still turn to nearby waters and banks for extra food. At Torksey, fishing weights show that people in the colder months also drew on local natural resources, not as a luxury, but as part of staying supplied. That matters because a winter holding was not sealed off from its landscape. Rivers, inlets, and edges of land could still yield something useful when fields were quiet. The work of feeding animals and feeding people sat close together, and a catch from nearby water helped keep that balance steadier. It also reminds us that winter provision was not only about grain and fodder stacked away in advance. A household could combine what it had saved with what the season still offered. The point is less about a special meal than about the practical range of a winter economy. When land-based stores ran low or needed stretching, nearby waters could add a little slack to the system, and that small difference mattered. In that sense, the cold months were not just a time of withdrawal, they were a time of careful reach, using what lay close at hand while the farm waited for the ground to open again. That kind of use fits the broader winter pattern, where a settlement depended on several small streams of supply at once, rather than one grand storehouse answer. Water, shore, and field all mattered, and each could soften the pressure on the others when the season tightened for a time. On some farms, animal care likely folded into broader household provisioning, so feeding beasts was never entirely separate from feeding people. A yard with stock was also a yard with stores, tools, and work that served more than one purpose. Milk, manure, young animals, and a chance to keep breeding stock alive all tied winter husbandry to the household's wider survival. The result was a practical overlap. Food did not move in one direction only, from field to table. It moved through the whole holding, and the care of animals helped shape how the household thought about its own winter reserves. If a family was watching its grain, hay, and dried produce, it was also watching what the animals could return, whether in spring labor, milk, or future growth. That made the season more than a waiting period. It was a managed exchange between mouths and stores. The household had to decide what could be spared, what had to be guarded, and what might be stretched a little farther without losing the stock. In that sense, winter husbandry was part of the same planning that kept the rest of the farm going, from the first rationed feed to the final weeks before pasture opened again. That overlap also explains why winter care could not be delegated to one task or corner of the farm. It sat inside the same calculation that governed bread, labor, and shelter throughout the season for people and animals alike, as measures kept thinning further. Winter shelter was never a matter of setting animals somewhere and forgetting them. Damp, wear, and constant repair shaped the same buildings that sheltered them, so shelter itself had to be maintained as part of the season's work. Roofs, walls, openings, and the ground underfoot all belonged to that care. because a wet structure could not stay useful for long. The point is not a picturesque barn in the snow. It is the ordinary pressure that moisture put on a working building. When people and animals shared a farmstead, repair was not a separate profession waiting in the wings. It was folded into daily management, with the household responding to whatever weather, leaks, settling timbers, or wear made worse. That is why winter keeping demanded more than feed. It demanded that the spaces holding the stock remain sound enough to do their job. A holding that let its buildings slide would lose comfort, order, and time at once. So the care of animals included care for the structure around them, and that structure had to stand up to repeated use through the cold months. In practice, the season asked the same people to watch both the stores and the shelter because one failed without the other. Even a solid-looking enclosure was only as useful as the labor that kept it serviceable, so winter shelter belonged to maintenance as much as to architecture, and its usefulness depended on attention that never stopped around the holding through the cold months each year. Fodder storage belonged to the same seasonal preparation that put a farm in order before the first hard weather. Feed had to be gathered, dried, stacked, and kept accessible enough to carry animals through the dark months without wasting labor on constant searching. That meant the holding was preparing not just for cold, but for the sequence of tasks cold would demand. Temporary accommodation helps make those logistics easier to picture, because winter life did not rely on one fixed arrangement forever. People and stock could be shifted, housed, or gathered where the season made most sense, and that flexibility mattered when weather, work, and access changed from week to week. The important thing is the pattern: storage first, then careful distribution, then the daily business of moving supplies into use. Once fodder was in place, it could be rationed alongside the rest of the household's winter reserves. That gave the farm room to keep going without pretending the season was simple. A wintering household did not survive by one grand act of preparation. It survived by stacking small certainties in advance and then using them with restraint. In that way, fodder storage was already part of the winter story before the animals ever reached the end of it. The cold season asked for movable habits as much as stored feed, and that made the farm feel less like a sealed compound than a working network of choices under winter pressure from one week to the next across the holding. A shelter with benches and a hearth suggests how some enclosed spaces could serve in the colder months, at least when compared with other buildings that had different jobs. Compared with a purpose-built animal enclosure, it looks less specialized and more adaptable. That is enough to show how winter spaces could blur their functions without becoming identical. In such a setting, the household could keep adjusting what it stored, what it repaired, and what it assigned to work, until the season finally loosened its hold. It hints at a place where staying warm, working, and gathering around shared space were all possible without saying that every winter household used the same arrangement. That comparison matters because it shows how flexible a farmstead could be when the weather narrowed choices. One structure might shelter stock, another might hold people, and another might do both in different degrees. The household did not need a perfect separation to make winter work. It needed enough overlap to keep daily life moving. That is why animal care cannot be separated from the wider winter rhythm. Reserves had to be held, buildings had to be repaired, and household labor had to keep meeting the season's demands. Those three things belonged together. When they stayed in step, the farm could carry its stock forward until grass and daylight returned. By then, the hard months were not over in an instant, but the balance had begun to shift, and the household's winter task was nearing its close. When winter settled in, travel with animals became a measured matter rather than an ordinary errand. Ice could open routes across water and low ground, but it also made footing uncertain, and a path that looked solid one day turned very dangerous the next. That shaped how people chose whether to move livestock at all, and it made every journey part caution, part calculation. In cold months, movement tended to narrow toward the places where shelter, fodder, and human attention were already close at hand. That did not mean animals vanished from daily life. It meant that winter care depended on planning around the hazards of frozen ground, drifting conditions, and the strain of moving beasts when the land itself offered poor traction. The season pushed households to treat distance differently. A route that was easy in warmer weather was plainly too costly once ice, wind, and darkness combined, so the practical rhythm of winter was often one of staying near, waiting, and moving only when the ground promised some advantage. In that sense, the cold did not simply pause travel. It changed the terms of it, and with them, the ordinary work of looking after animals until spring. For that reason, the winter household's animal care was as much about preserving options as using them, keeping paths, tasks, and bodies ready for the thaw that would make movement easier again, even when the season encouraged the opposite for a time, and only in the safest moments that winter allowed them. Winter mobility did not rely on bare feet, bare hooves, or sheer caution alone. People used traction devices, and horses could be fitted in ways that improved their grip when the surface turned slick. That small practical adjustment mattered because winter travel was not only about distance but about control. A load that was moved at all depended on whether the mover stayed fully upright, stayed balanced, and carefully kept the animal from slipping out of line. Alongside those devices came other forms of frozen season movement. Bone skates offered a way to glide over ice, and ice transport made the hard season itself into a route rather than a barrier. In the right conditions, frozen ground and water briefly carried movement that would otherwise be too slow or too burdensome. The result was not a triumphant conquest of winter, but a careful use of its own surface. That same logic helped shape the work of getting between home, outlying places, and seasonal tasks tied to animals. A household that could move on ice shifted what it carried, and when it carried it more easily. The cold made everything more conditional, yet it also created brief advantages for those who knew how to use the surface without trusting it too far. Winter mobility was therefore practical, limited, and opportunistic at once, a matter of harnessing what the weather briefly permitted. Those advantages mattered most when a household had animals and goods waiting to move before the ice weakened and thaw opened ways. That winter mobility shaped the whole schedule of animal care. Fodder, people, and livestock did not move freely in the same way at the same times, so the season forced each household to decide what was shifted now and what had to wait instead. Frozen ground helped with hauling, yet it also firmly pinned animals in place and made every trip a matter of careful timing. The practical result was a seasonal ordering of movement. Feed had to be gathered, stored, and then carried in conditions that made transport worthwhile. Animals that were kept near the household through the dark months depended on that earlier planning, because winter was not a season for casual redistribution. It was a season when every load had to justify the effort it took to haul it. The same logic applied to people. If a person could not move safely, then the animal care that person was meant to provide also faltered. Winter therefore tied mobility to maintenance. The household's choices about where animals stayed, where fodder sat, and who could travel were all part of the same rhythm. Spring would loosen those arrangements, but until then, the cold made movement selective and expensive, and that pressure reached from the sled or pack out to the buyer and back again. That pressure also narrowed the choices of neighbors and kin who might otherwise help move stock or share a route, because winter travel had to serve more than one purpose to be worth the risk. Winter care was not only about moving things. Damp inside and around buildings kept repair work necessary, because cold weather did not stop moisture from finding weak places in timber, roofing, and enclosure. A shelter that seemed sound in one part of the season demanded renewed attention later as thaw, seepage, and repeated wetting took their toll. That was especially important for any structure that held animals through the cold months. If walls loosened or roofs failed to keep out the weather, the space became harder to use for feed, bedding, or protection from wind. Repair, therefore, belonged to winter husbandry just as much as hauling or feeding did. The work did not have to be dramatic to matter. Small interventions, done in time, kept a shelter serviceable until spring. In a household economy, that meant the condition of animal spaces could not be postponed indefinitely. They had to be watched with the same steady attention as stores of food or tools. Wetness was a persistent problem because it made decay and discomfort work faster, and winter did not freeze that risk away. So the season asked for maintenance on two fronts at once: the animals themselves and the place that held them. A pen, byre, or wall that was kept in order helped preserve the feed and labor already committed to the season, and that practical care quietly reduced losses before the thaw opened new demands and made the coming change easier to meet without losing what winter had already secured. There was also the chance to gather another cold season resource from the water. Winter fishing could add to the household's supply when other paths were more constrained, and that mattered because animal care was never isolated from the wider flow of food and labor. A successful catch eased pressure on stored grain or on whatever feed a household had set aside for livestock, even if only modestly. More than that, the possibility itself shows how winter work reached beyond the byre. Ice and cold did not end resource gathering, they often shifted where and how it happened. The household that took advantage of that season had one more practical way to stretch supplies until grass returned. Such seasonal flexibility fit the rest of winter management. If travel was difficult, then a gain from water or ice offset some of the strain locally. If fodder moved slowly, then any extra food from the cold months helped hold the balance. Winter fishing was not a separate story from animal care. It belonged to the same effort to keep people and animals fed while movement remained restricted. That made the season feel less like a blank pause than a narrow set of working choices, each one carrying practical weight. Even the frozen margin of a lake or shoreline could matter when spring still felt far away. It also meant that care for animals could draw on more than one sort of winter labor, from hauling to harvesting, without treating any one task as enough by itself. By the end of winter, the care of animals had become a steady holding pattern. The household had already done the work of positioning shelter, managing movement, arranging fodder, and using whatever cold weather routes or tools could help. What remained was the patient maintenance that carried stock through the last stretch before the thaw. This was the season when small failures mattered most, because every weak place had to survive until ground and weather became kinder. Animals did not need grand gestures, they needed continuity. Feed, enclosure, and access all had to keep holding together while the land stayed difficult. The same was true for the people responsible for them. Winter had taught them when to move, when to wait, and when a frozen surface briefly served as a road for a little while. It had also taught them that damp, wear, and shortage did not stop merely because the calendar turned. So the quiet task was endurance. A household that kept animals through to spring preserved more than bodies. It preserved the working order that would let those bodies matter again when movement broadened and the season changed. The thaw would not create a new world from nothing, but it would open the next one. Until then, the practical art was to remain ready and to let the winter finish its slow work without losing what had already been secured. That restraint was the final form of care, and it carried the household from frozen pause toward the first workable weeks of spring. Winter warmth in a Viking household did not follow a single pattern. In some places and periods, the shape of a house changed with local practice, so one region's arrangement could differ sharply from another's. That makes the winter dwelling feel less like a universal blueprint and more like a local toolkit. The important point is that local resources mattered more than any fixed template. Stone, turf, timber, fuel, and access to trade all shaped what a household could do. Even inside one broad culture, the winter interior was socially uneven. People did not all meet the season from the same position, and the house itself could reflect that difference. By the time the dark months settled in, warmth was never simply about the fire alone. It was also about where a building stood, what it could gather, and who was inside it. That unevenness mattered before anyone reached for comfort, because the season sorted households by ability as well as by roof. The household's winter story began long before the cold arrived. That same flexibility carried into the building's later life. House biographies changed, so one building did not always keep one function, and a structure could serve different purposes as people and periods shifted around it. Winter care, therefore, depended on more than architecture alone. Status shaped clothing access and appearance, while textile production remained household labor, so the look of winter was never purely about weather. Better access to cloth, finish, and repair could make cold months easier to bear, yet the work behind those goods still sat inside the home. Household material access varied with status and living conditions, which meant that the same season could feel materially different from one household to the next. Warmth was only part of the picture. Clothing, upkeep, and the things a household could lay hands on set the limits of comfort as much as the walls did. In that sense, winter was measured not just in fuel, but in the ordinary reach of a household's belongings. Food could still widen the horizon even when the season narrowed it. Possible winter fishing offered another cold season resource, and that possibility matters because it points beyond the hall toward water, ice, and timing. A household did not need every need met in one place. Some provisions came from preserved stores, some from work done indoors, and some from routes that stayed open when other paths did not. The point is not a single dramatic solution, but a season stitched together from several kinds of access. In a long winter, that kind of variety could matter as much as any packed storehouse. It left the household less dependent on one reserve and more tied to the wider world that still moved, however slowly, beyond the snow line. That connection did not erase hardship, but it kept cold weather life from collapsing into a single pattern of waiting. It was one more way the season stayed practical, not mythical. For some households, that meant another line of food. For others, only a reminder that winter still allowed more than one kind of work. None of this should be confused with shelter on the road or with camp life, because those comparisons belong to a different kind of winter altogether. Farm animal care worked on its own terms, inside a household economy that had to carry creatures through the cold until spring returned. That made winter warmth into a boundary as much as a comfort, separating what could be kept close from what had to be guarded at a distance. People, cloth, fuel, food, and animals all pressed on the same household, yet they did not all ask for the same kind of answer. The result was not a perfect system, only a resilient one, built from local practice, social difference, and careful use of what the season left available. When the dark months eased, the household had not solved winter so much as outlasted it, and that was enough to carry the year forward into the first thaw, onward. The work simply changed shape, as winter always did for households.